The waitress behind the counter had bruises on both wrists and a smile that looked like it cost her everything she had left. She poured coffee with shaking hands while a man twice her size watched from the kitchen doorway, not with love, not with concern, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had already broken something beautiful and enjoyed watching the pieces try to hold together. Outside, freezing rain hammered a dying mining town called Black Hollow, where Hope left years ago and never sent a forwarding address. But something else was coming down that rain-soaked highway. Something loud, something dangerous, something that wore leather and rode in formation like a platoon returning from war. And when they walked through that door, nothing in this town would ever be the same. If you want to find out what happens when the most dangerous men in the county become the only ones willing to protect a woman everyone else pretends not to see, stay with me until the very end. Drop a like right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The town of Black Hollow sat in a valley between two ridges of exhausted Appalachian rock, the kind of place mapmakers forgot and highway planners routed around. Coal money built it 80 years ago. Coal leaving killed it 40 years after that. What remained was a skeleton dressed in rust, shuttered storefronts with plywood windows, a single gas station that closed at 6, a post office that operated 3 days a week, and a diner called the Silver Spoon that had never once lived up to its name. The sign outside flickered between pale blue and dead black. One letter burnt out, so it read, "The S. Silver Spoon," like even the building couldn't be bothered to hold itself together anymore. It was October. The kind of October that didn't bother with colors or beauty, just cold, just wet. Just that low-gray sky pressing down on everything beneath it like a hand pushing a drowning man deeper underwater. Fog clung to the ridgeline and crawled through the streets before dawn, and the only sounds in Black Hollow at 5:45 in the morning were the hiss of rain on asphalt and the occasional cough of a pickup truck engine somewhere down a back road where someone still had a reason to wake up. Evelyn Cross had reasons. None of them good. She stood in the bathroom of the apartment above the Silver Spoon, pressing a damp cloth against the left side of her jaw, where the swelling had turned from red to a deep, angry purple overnight. The mirror was cracked down the middle, had been for months, and in its fractured reflection, she looked like two different women stitched together wrong. One side almost normal, the other side something you'd cross the street to avoid looking at. She tilted her head, studied the bruise with the clinical detachment of someone who had cataloged too many of them, and reached for the foundation she kept in a Ziploc bag beneath the sink. 3 layers, blend outward, powder to set. She could do it in 4 minutes now. Used to take her 10. Practice makes perfect. That's what people said. She pulled on a long-sleeve shirt even though the diner's kitchen would turn into a furnace by noon. Sleeves hid wrists, scarves hid necks, foundation hid jaws. Sunglasses hid eyes. She had an entire wardrobe built not around fashion, but around geography. The geography of damage, the topography of where his hands landed, and how long each location took to heal. Jaw was 5 days, wrists were 3, ribs were 2 weeks, but nobody ever saw ribs anyway, so those were almost a relief. She didn't cry anymore. Crying required something she had run out of a long time ago. Downstairs, the diner was dark and cold. She flipped the breaker and fluorescent lights stuttered to life, buzzing like trapped insects overhead. The floor was warped hardwood, scarred from decades of boots and chair legs and spilled grease that nobody bothered cleaning properly. 6 booths along the windows, 8 stools at the counter, a kitchen through a swinging door that smelled permanently of burnt oil and old bacon fat. Evelyn started the coffee machine, and its gurgling filled the silence the way an IV fills a vein. Slow, mechanical, keeping something technically alive without making it better. She unlocked the front door at 6 sharp. Routine. Muscle memory. The same way she smiled, the same way she said morning to the first customers, the same way she pretended this was a life she had chosen rather than a cage she had walked into and couldn't find the door out of. Wade Turner owned the Silver Spoon, owned the building, owned the apartment upstairs, owned the truck she wasn't allowed to drive, owned the bank account she wasn't on, owned everything in her daily existence with the quiet, suffocating completeness of a man who understood that control didn't require chains when you could simply remove every option until the only path left was the one that led back to him. He was 46, barrel-chested, thinning hair he slicked back with too much product, and hands that were always a little too warm when they grabbed you. He smiled at customers. He coached Little League on Saturdays. He donated to the volunteer fire department every Christmas. And every few nights, behind closed doors with the television turned up loud enough to cover sounds, he became something the town would never believe because the town had decided long ago what kind of man Wade Turner was. And changing that opinion required effort nobody in Black Hollow had energy for. He came downstairs at 6:30, boots heavy on the stairs, each footfall a countdown. Evelyn's shoulders tightened before he even reached the bottom step. Her body had learned his rhythms the way animals learn the sound of a predator's approach. Not through thought, but through cellular memory, every nerve-ending cataloging speed, weight, direction, mood. Heavy steps meant anger. Light steps meant he wanted something. Medium steps meant he was neutral, which was the closest thing to safe she ever got. Today, the steps were heavy. "Coffee's weak," he said without tasting it. He stood behind the counter, too close, his chest almost touching her back while she arranged mugs. His breath smelled like last night's whiskey and this morning's mouthwash failing to cover it. "Told you about that. I'll make it stronger. You'll make it right." His fingers found her elbow, squeezed. Not hard enough to bruise. He was precise about that when marks might show on forearms in a short-sleeved moment, but hard enough that the message landed in her skeleton. "Don't make me repeat myself about anything today, Evie. I'm not in the mood." He released her and walked to the kitchen. The swinging door banged shut. Evelyn stood motionless for 3 seconds, eyes focused on nothing, breathing so controlled it was nearly mechanical. Then she poured the coffee down the drain and started a new pot. 2 regulars arrived by 7. Frank DeLuca, retired railroad worker, who sat in the same booth every morning and read the same newspaper he brought from home because Black Hollow didn't have a newsstand. Margaret Boone, who worked at the county clerk's office and stopped for toast and gossip before her commute. They both smiled at Evelyn. Margaret even asked how she was doing. Evelyn said fine. Margaret said that's good. And that was the entire depth of rescue available to Evelyn Cross in this town. A word and a nod and a return to toast. She had tried once, 11 months ago, called the sheriff's office from the payphone behind the gas station because Wade monitored her cell. Deputy Harlan Briggs came out, spoke to Wade on the porch for 20 minutes, then drove away. That night, Wade broke 2 of her fingers and told her the deputy was his hunting buddy, and if she ever called again, he'd make sure the next injury was somewhere doctors in the nearest hospital would have questions about. She believed him. Not because she was weak, because she had spent enough time in this town to understand that Wade Turner existed inside a machine of small-town loyalty that she would never penetrate. He was a local. She was from somewhere else. In Black Hollow, that distinction mattered more than Bruises. The morning dragged, rain thickened, fog pressed against the windows like something trying to get in or trying to keep everyone inside. Evelyn could never tell which. She refilled Frank's coffee twice, took Margaret's plate, wiped the counter in circles that went nowhere. The clock above the register read 7:52 when the sound started. Low at first, like distant thunder, except thunder didn't have a rhythm. This had a rhythm, a deep, rolling, mechanical heartbeat that grew louder and louder until the coffee mugs on the counter began to vibrate and the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker in sympathetic response. Frank looked up from his newspaper. Margaret set down her fork. Evelyn stopped wiping and turned toward the windows. Through the rain and fog, headlights appeared on the main road. Not one set, not 2, but a staggered column that stretched back into the mist like the spine of some enormous creature pulling itself out of the dark. The sound was unmistakable now. Harley-Davidsons. A dozen of them at least, maybe more, their engines shaking the air with the kind of authority that made buildings feel temporary. They moved in formation, tight, disciplined, deliberate. And the lead bike was a flat black Road King ridden by a man who sat in the saddle like he'd been born in it. They pulled into the gravel lot outside the Silver Spoon. Engines died one by one, each cut off leaving a deeper silence than the one before until the town felt like it was holding its breath. Kickstands went down. Boots hit wet gravel. Leather creaked. The front door opened and cold air rushed in carrying the smell of rain, exhaust, and road dust. Cade Mercer walked in first. He was 43, built like a man who had spent decades doing physical things he never talked about, with a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who started with good bone structure and then handed the chisel to 10 years of war and 20 years of highway. A scar ran from his left temple down past his ear, disappearing into the collar of a leather jacket so worn and cracked it looked like it had been through more than he had. His eyes were gray-green, the color of river stones, and they moved across the room the way a scope moves across a landscape, systematically, missing nothing, categorizing everything. Ex-Marine. 2 tours in places that didn't make the news until body bags started coming home. Silver Star recipient, though the medal sat in a drawer he never opened because the memory attached to it involved carrying what was left of his best friend across 400 meters of open ground while tracers split the air above his head. He didn't talk about it. Didn't need to. The war lived in his posture, in the way he never sat with his back to a door, in the way his hands were never fully relaxed, always half-curled, always ready, always one synapse away from something most people couldn't imagine. He founded the Iron Revenants 12 years ago in a garage outside of Knoxville with 4 other veterans who couldn't sleep, couldn't hold jobs, couldn't stop hearing things that weren't there. The club grew slowly, not through recruitment, but through gravity, damaged men finding each other the way water finds its level. They wore the patch, not because they wanted to be outlaws, but because normal society had made it clear there was no chair at the table for men who had seen what they'd seen and done what they'd done. The patch said, "We are still here." The formation said, "We still matter." The road said, "We are going somewhere even if we don't know where." Behind Cade came Roach, 6'4", former Army Ranger, shaved head tattooed with coordinates of every mission he survived, quiet in a way that made people nervous because you couldn't tell if he was calm or calculating. Then Duke, the club's sergeant-at-arms, a wiry Cajun with a prosthetic left hand he never tried to hide, and a voice like gravel being dragged across sheet metal. Then the others, Preacher, Hound, Skids, Moth, Calico, Bowie, Wrench. Names earned, not given, each one a story nobody outside the club would ever hear in full. They filled the diner the way weather fills a valley, changing the pressure, changing the temperature, making everything that was already there feel different just by proximity. Evelyn felt her hands go cold. She had seen bikers before, passing through. They came in groups of 2 or 3, ate fast, tipped badly, left. These were different. These men didn't swagger. They moved with a heavy, coordinated economy, like soldiers entering an unfamiliar building, aware of exits, aware of sightlines, aware of each other. They filled booths without argument, hung helmets on hooks without discussion, and settled into seats with the mechanical precision of men who had done this exact thing in 1,000 diners across 1,000 forgotten towns. "Coffee," Cade said. Not to Evelyn, to the room. The word carried no entitlement, no demand, just a statement of need offered to whoever could fill it. Evelyn moved, muscle memory again, pot in hand, mugs distributed, cream pitchers restocked. She worked her way through the booths, and the men thanked her, actually thanked her, with nods and low voices, and the kind of eye contact that acknowledged her as a human being rather than a function. It was such a small thing. Such a devastatingly small thing that it nearly broke her right there between booth 4 and booth 5. Cade watched her from the counter, not staring, not leering, watching the way a man watches something he recognizes. The forced smile, the controlled movements, the sleeves pulled too far over the wrists, the way she flinched when the kitchen door banged, not at the sound itself, but at the implication of who might be behind it. He knew those signs. Knew them like he knew the sound of incoming rounds, because 17 years ago his younger sister Lily had shown the same signs, and he had been too deep in his own post-war wreckage to read them properly. By the time he did, she was in a hospital bed in Roanoke with a collapsed lung, a shattered orbital bone, and a husband who posted bail before the paperwork was dry. 3 months later, Lily was dead. Coroner called it an accidental fall. Cade called it the thing that split his life into before and after. Before, he was just broken. After, he was broken and haunted, and the haunting was worse because it came with the specific surgical knowledge that he could have stopped it if he had just paid attention. He paid attention now, to everything, to everyone. especially to women who smiled too carefully and flinched at sounds they should have been used to. The kitchen door swung open and Wade Turner walked out carrying a plate of eggs nobody had ordered. He set it on the counter in front of Cade without asking, the way a man stakes a claim on territory. Feeding the stranger was an act of dominance, not hospitality, establishing that this was his place, his counter, his diner, his woman behind it. "On the house," Wade said, with a smile that lived only on his mouth. "Don't get many visitors this time of year. Where you boys headed?" "South," Cade said. He didn't touch the eggs. "South's a big place." "That's the point." Wade's smile tightened. He didn't like short answers. Short answers denied him the control that conversation provided, the ability to steer, to assess, to position himself as the center of every exchange. He glanced at the booths full of bikers, then back at Cade, recalibrating. "You all with a club?" "We are." "Which one?" Cade lifted his coffee, drank slowly, set it down. "Iron Revenants." "Never heard of you." "Good." Wade waited for more. More didn't come. His jaw tightened the same way it tightened before his fist did, and Evelyn recognized the shift from across the counter. Her body went rigid. She turned away, reaching for napkins she didn't need, creating distance from whatever was about to happen. But nothing happened. Wade just nodded, smiled that dead smile again, and went back to the kitchen. The swinging door closed. Silence resettled over the diner like dust after an explosion. Cade looked at Evelyn. She was gripping the napkin dispenser hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Her breathing was shallow. The scarf around her neck had shifted, and in the gap, just for a second, he saw a bruise. Dark, finger-shaped, days old, climbing the side of her throat like ivy on a condemned building. He said nothing. Finished his coffee. Left a 20 on the counter for a $3 cup. Nodded once to Evelyn as he stood, a nod that said nothing and everything at the same time. Then walked out into the rain where his brothers were already mounting their bikes. "We stayin'?" Roach asked. Not a question, an assessment. He had seen Cade's face, and he had been riding with the man long enough to know what that particular stillness meant. "One more day." Roach didn't argue. He pulled a cigarette from behind his ear, lit it in the rain, and squinted at the diner through the smoke. "The waitress?" Cade didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was louder than any confirmation. They rode to the only motel in Black Hollow, a 12-unit cinder block building called the Mountain Rest that hadn't been renovated since the decade it was built. The owner, a nervous man named Carl Jessup, took one look at the column of motorcycles in his parking lot and nearly swallowed his own tongue. Cade paid cash for 4 rooms, didn't ask for receipts, and told Carl they'd be quiet. "How long you staying?" Carl managed. "Until we're done." Carl accepted this the way people in Black Hollow accepted most things, by pretending it was normal and hoping the abnormality would resolve itself before it became his problem. Inside room 6, Cade sat on the edge of a bed that sagged in the middle like a sigh. He pulled off his boots, set them by the door, old habit, always ready to move, and pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw static. The image wouldn't leave. The bruise on Evelyn's neck, the geometry of it, fingers, a hand, somebody's hand wrapped around her throat tight enough to leave a map of themselves behind. Lily had bruises like that, in the same places, with the same explanations that weren't explanations, but walls built from words to keep questions out. I fell. I hit the cabinet. I'm clumsy. You know me. He knew her. That was the problem. He knew her, and he still failed her. The rain picked up outside, hammering the motel's thin roof like a drum cadence. Cade lay back on the bed, still dressed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Somewhere in the parking lot, Duke and Preacher were sharing a flask under the awning, their low voices carrying through the walls as shapeless murmurs. Somewhere across town, Evelyn Cross was probably standing in a bathroom pressing a cloth against something that hurt, cataloging the damage with the same dead efficiency she brought to pouring coffee and hiding scars. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph so creased and worn the image was nearly translucent. Lily, 22 years old. Standing in the doorway of their mother's house in West Virginia with a smile that was already starting to dim around the edges. He carried it everywhere, not as a memorial, as a reminder. A reminder that doing nothing was a choice, and choices had weight, and weight accumulated until it crushed whatever was beneath it. Evening fell on Black Hollow the way evening falls in places that have already given up. Not gradually, but all at once, as if the town simply lacked the energy to hold daylight any longer. Streetlights came on in patches, half of them broken, casting incomplete circles of amber that made the wet streets look like the surface of something sick. Cade walked alone through the rain, jacket collar up, cigarette unlit between his lips because he'd quit 3 years ago but still carried them for the weight of habit in his hand. He passed the volunteer fire department. Closed. The library. Closed. The sheriff's substation, where a single patrol car sat in the lot with condensation on the windows and no sign of life inside. He walked past the Silver Spoon, dark now, closed for the night, and looked up at the lit window on the second floor where a shadow moved behind a thin curtain. Then the shadow stopped moving. Then the light went off. He stood in the rain for a long time, watching that dark window, remembering another dark window in Roanoke 17 years ago, and all the things he didn't do when he still had the chance. Back at the motel, the revenants had gathered in the room they used as a common space. Room 8, the largest, though largest was relative. Roach sat on the floor with his back against the heater, cleaning his fingernails with a folding knife. Duke leaned against the doorframe, prosthetic hand tapping a quiet rhythm against the wood. Preacher sat cross-legged on the bed reading a battered paperback he'd carried for 3 states. The others were scattered across chairs and floor space, drinking gas station beer and talking in the low, unhurried way men talk when they have nowhere to be and nothing to prove. The room went quiet when Cade walked in. Not because they feared him, because they could read him. And what they read in his face right now was a weather system they all recognized. The cold front that descended whenever something hooked into the part of Cade that never healed. "Town's got a problem," Cade said. He didn't sit. "What kind?" Duke asked. "The kind we don't ride away from." Roach looked up from his knife. "The Waitress." Cade nodded. "Saw the marks," Roach continued. "Wrists, neck, she's carrying a full map." Silence. The heater clicked and hummed. Rain ran down the window in crooked lines. "Who's the man?" Duke asked. "Owns the diner. Name's Wade Turner. Local. Connected. The kind of connected where cops go hunting with him on weekends, and the town looks the other way because looking the other way is cheaper than looking straight." Preacher closed his book and set it on the mattress. "You talked to her?" Asked if she was safe. "And?" "She lied." More silence, the kind of silence that builds pressure, that compresses the air between men who have been trained to act and are now being asked to think first. "We don't know her story," Preacher said carefully, not arguing, measuring. "Could be complicated. Could be she's got reasons for staying that we can't see." "There's always reasons," Cade replied. "Doesn't make the Bruises fictional." "I'm not saying it does. I'm saying we rode into this town 6 hours ago and we're already talking about getting involved in someone's life. That's not a criticism, just a fact." Duke straightened from the doorframe. "Cade, what's the move?" "No move yet. Tomorrow morning we go back to the diner. We sit. We watch. We learn the shape of it." "And if the shape is what we think it is?" Cade looked at Duke, and his eyes held something that wasn't anger but was adjacent to it. A cold, focused resolve that lived in the space between patience and action. "Then we don't leave." Morning broke gray and bitter. Temperature dropped overnight, and thin ice glazed the puddles in the motel parking lot. The revenants mounted their bikes at 5:30, breath visible in the dark, engines splitting the pre-dawn silence of Black Hollow like a declaration. They rode in formation to the Silver Spoon, parked in a line that took up the entire front lot, and walked inside before the diner was technically open. The door was unlocked. Evelyn was already behind the counter. She looked up when they entered, and for a fraction of a second, something other than exhaustion crossed her face. Not relief, not hope, something smaller and more fragile than either. Recognition, maybe. The simple animal recognition of familiar shapes returning to a place where everything else was threatening. "We're early," Cade said, an apology without the word. "Coffee's ready," she said. A welcome without the word. They took the same seats as yesterday, Same booths, same stools, as if the arrangement had been decided by something deeper than preference. Evelyn poured coffee, and the ritual repeated. The mugs, the nods, the low voices saying thank you, the small human acknowledgments that cost nothing and meant everything to a woman who received none of them from the man who shared her bed. Cade sat at the counter again. This time he noticed more. The way Evelyn held the coffee pot with her right hand only, keeping her left arm close to her body as if protecting something beneath the sleeve. The slight limp she tried to disguise by leaning against the counter between trips. The fresh swelling along her left cheekbone that the foundation almost covered but not quite, because the fluorescent lights in a diner are merciless and they reveal what softer lighting might forgive. Something happened last night. After that window went dark. Wade emerged from the kitchen at 6:40. Same boots, same heavy footsteps, same territorial energy radiating off him like heat from an engine block. He paused when he saw the bikers had returned, and something shifted in his face. Not fear, not yet, but the preliminary awareness that a variable had entered his controlled environment and wasn't behaving according to expectations. Back again, he said to Cade. Friendly voice, dead eyes. Best coffee in the valley, Cade replied. Only coffee in the valley. Wade laughed. Nobody else did. He moved behind the counter, and Evelyn shifted away from him. A small movement, automatic, the way a compass needle moves away from interference. Wade noticed the shift. His eyes narrowed. He reached past her for a towel, deliberately invading her space, his forearm pressing against her injured side hard enough that her breath caught in a tiny sound she tried to swallow. Cade's hands went flat on the counter. Every biker in the room heard it. The soft slap of palms against wood, a sound so mundane it shouldn't have meant anything but somehow meant everything. Roach stopped chewing. Duke's prosthetic hand froze mid-tap. Even Preacher looked up from his coffee. Wade didn't notice. He was too focused on Evelyn, on the micro-expressions of pain he'd learned to extract from her the way a craftsman extracts sound from an instrument, precisely, deliberately, with practiced skill. Evie, he said, voice low enough that only she and Cade could hear. I need you in the kitchen, now. She set down the coffee pot, didn't look at Cade, didn't look at anyone. Just walked to the kitchen with her head down and her arms wrapped around her midsection like she was holding herself together, and the swinging door closed behind her with a sound like a sentence ending. Cade sat very still. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Rain began again outside, tapping the windows in irregular patterns. From somewhere behind the kitchen door, a voice rose, Wade's voice, not shouting but pressurized, the dangerous hiss of a man who didn't need volume to inflict damage. Then a sound, short, sharp, the unmistakable percussion of an open hand meeting skin. Every revenant in that diner heard it. And in the silence that followed, that crystalline, catastrophic silence, Cade Mercer reached into his jacket and placed Lily's photograph face down on the counter, as if putting a ghost to rest or waking one up. And the look in his eyes said that whatever happened next in Black Hollow was no longer about coffee, or passing through, or staying one more day. It was about something he failed to do 17 years ago, and he would not fail again. The sound from behind that kitchen door lived inside Cade's chest like a bullet fragment too deep to remove. He sat at the counter with both hands flat on the wood, fingers spread, knuckles whitening, every tendon in his forearms drawn tight enough to hum. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Rain tapped the windows. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, and he hadn't touched it since Evelyn disappeared through the swinging door 4 minutes ago, and 4 minutes was long enough to build a war inside a man who had already fought too many of them. Roach was watching him from booth 3, not moving, not speaking, just watching with the flat, assessing stare of a man who had spent years reading body language in combat zones where misreading it meant someone died. Duke had stopped tapping his prosthetic hand against the table. Preacher had set his coffee down with deliberate care, as if the mug might detonate. The other revenants sat in various states of controlled stillness, each one processing the same sound, that sharp, percussive crack of palm against skin, and each one arriving at the same conclusion through different doors. The kitchen door swung open. Evelyn came out first. Left cheek redder than before, eyes glassed over with the distant focus of someone who had left her body and was watching herself from somewhere safer. She picked up the coffee pot, refilled Frank DeLuca's mug without being asked, and moved to the next table with the mechanical precision of a woman who had learned to keep working through anything because stopping meant feeling and feeling meant collapsing. Wade came out behind her, smiling. That same hollow smile, all teeth and no temperature. He wiped his hands on a towel, tossed it over his shoulder, and leaned against the kitchen door frame like a man surveying property he was proud of. Cade stood up. The motion was slow, deliberate. The way a storm gathers before it breaks. No rush, no urgency, just the inevitable accumulation of force. His leather jacket creaked. His boots found the floor with a weight that made the nearest coffee mugs tremble. He didn't look at Wade. He looked at Evelyn. And when she finally met his eyes, just for a second, just a fractured glance between the coffee pot and the next table, he saw it. Not a request, not a plea, something worse. Resignation. The total devastating acceptance of a woman who had stopped believing rescue was something that happened to people like her. Evelyn. Cade's voice was low enough that only she could hear it. You don't have to go back in that kitchen. She froze. The coffee pot hovered mid-pour. For one trembling second, the entire architecture of her survival, the smiles, the sleeves, the foundation, the lies, threatened to crack wide open. Then Wade's voice cut across the room like a blade through rope. Evie, counter needs wiping. She moved. Away from Cade, toward Wade, back into the orbit of the man who hurt her, because orbits are gravitational, and gravity doesn't care about intention or kindness or the scarred hands of a stranger offering something that looked like safety but felt like a trap she couldn't afford to test. Cade watched her go. His jaw worked. The muscle beneath his left ear pulsed. Then he sat back down, picked up his cold coffee, and drank it in one long swallow that tasted like failure. Outside, the rain turned to sleet. Black Hollow grew colder. The Revenants left the diner at 8:15, engines shattering the morning quiet of the main street as they rode back to the Mountain Rest Motel in formation. Nobody spoke during the ride. The sleet needled their faces and the road was slick under their tires. But discomfort was irrelevant to men who had endured worse in places they couldn't name and wouldn't if they could. In room 8, the common room, the argument began before Cade had finished pulling off his gloves. We need to talk about this, Preacher said. He was standing by the window, arms crossed, the paperback he always carried tucked into his back pocket like a weapon of a different kind. Preacher's real name was Dale Cormick, and he earned his road name not because of any spiritual calling, but because he was the one who always delivered the sermons nobody wanted to hear, the careful, measured truths that the rest of the club would rather ride past at 90 miles an hour. So talk, Cade said. You're not here for coffee. Never said I was. And you're not here because the road goes south and we happen to stop. You're here because of that woman, and everyone in this room knows it, and nobody's saying it because nobody wants to be the one who tells you that this feels like Roanoke. The name hit the room like a concussion grenade. Silent, devastating. Every man in that space knew what Roanoke meant. It was the word they never used around Cade, the scar they never touched, the frequency they all avoided because tuning into it meant watching their president come apart in ways that couldn't be fixed with whiskey or highway or time. Cade turned slowly. His eyes found Preacher's and held them. Don't. I have to. Because the last time you decided to save someone, you almost... I said don't. Oh, you almost killed a man with your bare hands in a hospital parking lot, Cade. And the only reason you're not sitting in a cell in Virginia right now is because Roach pulled you off before the cameras caught up. The room contracted. Roach shifted against the wall but didn't speak. The memory was in his body, the weight of Cade thrashing under his arms, the blood on Cade's knuckles, the unconscious body of Lily's husband crumpled against a sedan with his jaw displaced and 3 teeth scattered across the pavement like dice. That was the night after the funeral. That was the night Cade Mercer discovered that grief and rage share the same anatomy, and once one starts, the other follows until somebody stops them, or nobody does. Duke spoke from the corner, his voice like gravel in a blender. Preach ain't wrong, brother. Doesn't mean he's right either, but he ain't wrong. We roll into a town, we pick a fight with a local. We got no backup, no intel, no exit strategy. That's not a rescue operation. That's a funeral procession with the bodies still walking. Nobody's picking a fight, Cade said. Then what are we doing? I told you, watching, learning the shape of it. You learned the shape of it this morning when that woman came out of a kitchen with a fresh handprint on her face, Preacher said. So what's the next step? Because if the next step is you walking across that diner and putting Wade Turner through a wall, we need to discuss what comes after. What comes after is his problem. What comes after is our problem. Every patch in this room. Every man who rides under the same colors. You go sideways in this town, we all go sideways. That's not how this works, and you know it. Cade's hands curled at his sides. Not into fists, into something worse. That half grip of restrained violence that every revenant recognized as the space between control and catastrophe. He walked to the window and stood there, staring out at the parking lot where their bikes sat in a line under the sleet, chrome-dulled, leather seats darkening with moisture. My sister's dead, he said quietly. She's dead because I watched. I learned the shape of it. I was careful. I was measured. I gave her space. I respected her autonomy. I did all the things you're supposed to do, and she died with a collapsed lung in a hospital bed while I sat in a waiting room reading a magazine about fishing. He turned from the window. I'm not going through that again. Not here. Not anywhere. Silence. The heater clicked. Sleet ticked against the glass. Somewhere outside, a truck engine coughed and died. Nobody's asking you to go through that again, Preacher said, and his voice was softer now, carrying the specific tenderness of a man who knew he was navigating a minefield built from someone else's grief. I'm asking you to think before you act. Because if you go after Wade Turner on emotion alone, you'll either end up in jail or in the ground, and either way, that woman is still stuck in the same kitchen with the same man and one less person in the world who noticed. The logic landed. Kay didn't acknowledge it, but the tension in his shoulders shifted from rigid to heavy. The difference between a man preparing to fight and a man accepting that fighting wasn't the first step, even if it was the only step he wanted. Fine, he said. We learn more, but we don't ride out. Not yet. Agreed, Duke said. But we need ground rules. Nobody approaches Wade. Nobody threatens Wade. Nobody makes any move that tips him off. We're passing through. We like the coffee. That's the story. And the woman? Roach asked from his corner, his first word since the diner. His voice was low and unhurried, carrying the calm of a man who could wait for days if the objective required it. The woman decides, Preacher said. She has to want out. Otherwise, we're just another set of hands pulling her somewhere she didn't choose to go. Cade flinched. Barely visible, but the men who knew him saw it. The word choose landed wrong, because he had watched Lily choose to stay 6 different times before the last time, and every one of those choices was made inside a cage that looked like a home and sounded like love and felt like dying by inches. She doesn't know she has options, Cade said, but that's not the same as choosing. Then we show her she has options, carefully, without blowing everything up. Preacher looked at him steadily. Can you do that? The question hung in the room like smoke. Cade held Preacher's gaze for a long time, long enough that the other men began to shift in their seats, because the tension between their president and their conscience was pulling the room apart at molecular level. Yeah, Cade said finally. I can do that. Nobody in the room fully believed him, including Cade. The day passed in cold increments. Duke made calls from the motel's landline. The mountain rest was old enough to still have one, reaching contacts in nearby counties, asking casual questions about Black Hollow, about Wade Turner, about the sheriff's office and its jurisdictional habits. What came back was a portrait painted in whispers. Wade Turner, born and raised in Black Hollow, inherited the diner from his father, coached youth sports, donated to local causes, known by everyone, suspected by no one. The sheriff, a man named Roy Gatlin, had been Wade's friend since high school. They fished together. They drank together. They protected each other the way small-town power structures always did. Not through conspiracy, but through the quiet, reflexive loyalty of men who had known each other long enough that questioning one meant questioning all of them. Roach spent the afternoon walking the town, not scouting, just walking, observing. He noted that the Silver Spoon was the only restaurant in town, which meant Evelyn couldn't leave without leaving everything: her job, her housing, her only source of income in a place where income sources had been dying for decades. He noted the absence of a women's shelter within 40 miles. He noted the one deputy sheriff's office with its single patrol car and its connection to Wade Turner. He noted the bus station, a bench and a sign on the highway shoulder, serviced twice a day, once at 6 in the morning and once at 4 in the afternoon. 2 chances to leave. If you knew they existed. If you had money for a ticket. If you weren't being watched every hour of every day by a man who had removed every option until the only path left was the one that led back to him. Roach returned to the motel at dusk and laid it all out for Cade in the clipped, efficient language of a mission briefing. Target environment, isolated. Subject status, controlled. Hostile capability, local authority alignment, extraction difficulty, moderate to high. She's locked in, Roach concluded, financially, geographically, socially. He built the cage piece by piece and she can't see the bars because the bars look like normal life. Cade sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on knees, staring at the floor between his boots. The photograph of Lily lay face up on the nightstand. He hadn't put it back in his jacket. What about family? None I could find. Waitress at the gas station said Evelyn showed up in town about 3 years ago, alone, no car, no connections. Wade hired her the first week, moved her into the apartment upstairs by the second month. Classic isolation play. Find someone with nowhere to go and become the only place they have. Cade closed his eyes. Behind the lids, he saw Lily's apartment in Roanoke. The locks on the outside of the bathroom door. The phone with the call history deleted every night. The way she talked about Marcus, her husband, with the careful, rehearsed language of a woman who had been coached on what to say and punished for deviation. We go back tomorrow, Cade said. Same routine, coffee, quiet. We give her something she hasn't had in 3 years. What's that? Witnesses. Evening turned the motel into a cave of yellow light and road-weary bodies. The revenants gathered in room 8 again, this time with a bottle of bourbon that Moth had sourced from the gas station. Bottom shelf, harsh enough to strip paint, exactly what they were used to. They drank in the measured way men drink when they're processing something heavy. Not for oblivion, but for the slight softening of edges that allows difficult thoughts to be handled without drawing blood. Hound, who rarely spoke and never without purpose, broke the quiet from his position on the floor against the far wall. He was the youngest revenant, 29, former Navy corpsman, with medical training he used to patch up the club and nightmares he used bourbon to patch up himself. I want to check her injuries. Cade looked at him. Not now, Hound continued. Not without her permission. But if she'll let me, I want to see how bad it is. The way she's guarding that left side could be ribs. Cracked ribs don't heal right without treatment, and they damn sure don't heal at all if someone keeps cracking them. The clinical accuracy of Hound's observation made the room colder. These were men who understood violence intimately. Its mechanics, its aftermath, its medical consequences. And hearing it described in professional terms stripped away whatever distance remained between abstract concern and concrete reality. If she lets you, Cade said, and only if. Understood. The bourbon made another round. Duke rolled a cigarette one-handed, a skill he had perfected since losing the left hand to an IED outside Fallujah, and smoked it by the cracked window, exhaling into the gap between glass and frame so the room didn't fill. The smoke curled upward and disappeared into the dark gap like a question nobody wanted to answer. There's something else, Duke said without turning from the window. That deputy, Briggs, Harlan Briggs, I asked around. He's not just Wade's hunting buddy, he's Wade's cousin. The information settled over the room like a second layer of cold. So the only law in town is family, Cade said. Blood family. And the sheriff, Gatlin, he's Wade's friend going back 30 years. So the law isn't just connected to the threat. The law is the threat. Or at least the fence around it. Preacher set his mug down. Then we can't involve local authorities, even if we wanted to. County? State? Moth asked. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, a thin man with quick eyes and a talent for logistics that had kept the club fed and fueled across 20,000 miles of highway. County Sheriff's Office is 40 miles east, State Police Barracks even farther. By the time either of them responded to a call from Black Hollow, Wade would have 2 hours to clean up whatever he wanted to clean up. And that's assuming the call gets made at all, which it won't, because Briggs is the one who dispatches. Cade stood, walked to the window, stood beside Duke, and the two men looked out at the dark parking lot where sleet had turned to snow. The first snow of the season, light and dry, dusting the motorcycles like ash. "This isn't a rescue," Cade said quietly. "Not yet. It's a siege. He's got her locked inside a system designed to keep her invisible, and we're standing outside the walls trying to find a door." "Every siege has a weakness," Duke said. "Yeah. And usually the weakness costs something." They stood in silence, watching the snow fall on their machines, on the broken road, on a town that had forgotten how to care about anything, including itself. Behind them, the revenants finished their bourbon and settled into the particular quiet of men preparing for something they couldn't yet name. Not sleep, not action, but the restless, charged stillness that precedes both. Third morning, 5:30. Engines in the dark. Formation through town. The Silver Spoon. This time, Evelyn was waiting by the door. Not outside. She wouldn't risk that. Not in a town where Wade had eyes in every window and loyalty in every pocket. But inside by the entrance, with coffee already poured into a row of mugs on the counter, arranged in the exact number she had counted yesterday. She remembered how many of them there were. She remembered. Cade walked in and saw the mugs, counted them. 14. One for each revenant who had entered the diner yesterday. Exact. He looked at her. She looked away. But the ghost of something moved across her face. Not a smile, not even the memory of one, but the faintest acknowledgement that she had done something for herself, something that existed outside the parameters Wade had set for her existence, and the smallness of it was devastating because it revealed how narrow her world had become. "Thank you," Cade said. She nodded. A fraction of a movement. Then she turned away and began working the kitchen as if nothing had happened. The morning passed. Wade appeared at his usual time, performed his usual inspection, issued his usual corrections in the low, venomous register that passed for communication between them. The revenants watched without watching, a skill learned in territories where visible attention could trigger a response. They drank coffee, ate eggs, read newspapers they didn't care about, and built a picture of Wade Turner's daily routine with the unconscious efficiency of men trained in surveillance. At 9:15, Wade left the diner, got into his truck, a silver Dodge Ram with aftermarket lights and a gun rack in the rear window, and drove east on the county road. Duke, who had positioned himself by the front window, noted the time. Moth, who had been sitting in the booth closest to the door, slipped outside and watched the truck until it disappeared around the ridge bend. "He'll be gone an hour at least," Moth said when he came back in. "Gas station clerk said he goes to the county seat every Wednesday for supplies." This was the window. Cade knew it. The revenants knew it. Even the air in the diner seemed to know it, growing lighter, losing the oppressive density that Wade's presence imposed on every molecule in the room. Cade moved to the counter. Evelyn was wiping it in those same endless circles, head down, shoulders curved inward like parentheses around something she was protecting. He sat on the stool directly across from her and waited until the cloth stopped moving. "He's gone," Cade said. She didn't look up. "He comes back." "I know. But right now he's gone, and I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it without the answer you've been trained to give." The cloth resumed its circles. Slower now, tighter. Her breathing changed, shorter, shallower, the respiratory pattern of a body preparing for threat. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "Nobody in this room is going to hurt you. I know that's a sentence you've heard before, and it turned out to be a lie. I can't fix that. All I can tell you is that every man sitting in those booths has been hurt by someone they trusted, and not one of them became the thing that hurt them. We know what it looks like. We know what it feels like. And we know what it does to a person when the whole world pretends it isn't happening." The cloth stopped. Evelyn's hands were shaking, not the tremor he had seen before, the low-grade vibration of chronic fear, but a deeper structural trembling that came from somewhere inside her framework, threatening to let go. "What do you want?" she whispered. "To know if you want out." The question landed in the space between them like a dropped grenade. Evelyn's eyes came up for the first time. Really came up. Not the fractured glance or the automatic customer service flicker, but a full, unguarded look that hit Cade in the sternum because what he saw in those eyes wasn't fear. It was something beyond fear. It was the face of someone who had been drowning so long that the concept of air had become theoretical. "You don't understand," she said. Her voice was barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of sleet against glass. "He owns everything, the building, the apartment, the account with my name on it that I can't access. He knows the sheriff, he knows the deputy, he knows every person in this town, and every person in this town knows him. And if I leave, if I even try to leave, he'll know before I reach the highway." "Where would you go? If none of that mattered?" She stared at him. The question was so foreign, so removed from the architecture of her daily existence, that she literally didn't know how to process it. Where would she go? As if going was possible. As if the world contained directions that didn't curve back to this counter, this diner, this man, this life. "I don't—" She stopped, swallowed, looked down at her hands, still trembling around the cloth. "I had a cousin in Asheville. We lost touch." "Asheville's 4 hours from here. It might as well be the moon." "It's not the moon. It's 4 hours on a highway that exists right now, and there's a bus that runs from the shoulder out front at 6 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon." Her eyes widened. Not because the information was new, she must have known about the bus, but because someone else was saying it. Someone was constructing a path out loud, with specific details, treating escape not as a fantasy but as logistics. And logistics could be solved. Logistics were real. "He'd find me." "Not if you don't want to be found." "You don't know him." "I know men like him. I knew one who killed my sister." The sentence left Cade's mouth before he could stop it. Raw. Unfiltered. A piece of himself he hadn't voluntarily shown to anyone outside the club in 17 years. Offered to a stranger across a diner counter because the alternative was silence, and silence was what killed Lily. Evelyn's expression changed. The drowning look receded, replaced by something sharper. The recognition of shared damage. The specific, unspoken bond between people who have both been inside the machine and understand its mechanics from the inside out. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry. Be ready." "Ready for what?" "For the moment when you decide you're worth more than this. We'll be here when that happens." She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of tires on gravel froze every person in the diner. Through the front window, headlights swung across the lot. Not Wade's silver Dodge, but a black and white patrol car with a light bar on top and a county seal on the door. Deputy Harlan Briggs. He stepped out of the cruiser with the deliberate, bow-legged walk of a man who wore authority like an oversized coat. Too much of it for his frame, draped on for effect rather than fit. Mid-30s, soft around the middle, with a blonde mustache that looked like it was trying harder than the man beneath it. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon, but near it, in that performative zone where the proximity to the gun did the talking. He walked into the Silver Spoon and stopped when he saw the diner full of leather and patches. His eyes swept the room the way a man counts threats, when he's not actually capable of handling them. Fast, nervous, overcompensating with posture. "Morning," Briggs said, to no one in particular. "Morning," Evelyn said from behind the counter, and her voice had already changed, shifted back to the rehearsed register, the submissive frequency, the sound of a woman who understood that this uniform was not protection but surveillance. Briggs sat at the far end of the counter. Evelyn brought him coffee without being asked. He watched the revenants the way a dog watches a larger dog, sideways, with manufactured disinterest covering genuine unease. "Wait around?" he asked Evelyn. "Supply run. Back by noon." Briggs nodded, sipped his coffee. Then he looked directly at Cade, and the performance of casual authority evaporated, replaced by something more honest and more dangerous, raw territorial anxiety. "You boys passing through?" "We are," Cade said. "Been passing through for 3 days now. Most people pass through in an afternoon. We like the scenery." Briggs smiled. It didn't reach his eyes any more than Wade's smile reached his. "Scenery's better in the next county. Friendlier, too." Is that advice or instruction? Call it a courtesy. Cade lifted his coffee, drank, set it down. Courtesy is a funny word coming from a man who drove out here to check on his cousin's diner instead of checking on his cousin's waitress. The temperature in the silver spoon dropped 10 degrees. Briggs's hand moved an inch closer to his belt. Evelyn, behind the counter, went white. Not pale, not flushed. White. The color of someone watching two worlds collide and knowing she'll be standing in the debris. I don't know what you think you're... I don't think anything, Deputy. I notice things. Occupational hazard. Cade's eyes were flat and steady, two gray stones set in a face that had been trained to show nothing. I notice bruises. I notice flinching. I notice a woman who jumps every time a door opens and a law enforcement officer who sits 10 feet from her and never once asks if she's okay. Briggs stood up. His chair scraped the floor. The sound was sharp enough to make Evelyn flinch, which proved Cade's point with a precision that no argument could have matched. You need to mind your business, Briggs said. His voice had thickened, the friendliness gone, replaced by the voice he used on back roads at 2 a.m. when the dashcam was conveniently angled wrong. This is my town. These are my people. And you're visitors. You want to keep visiting. You keep your observations to yourself. Cade didn't stand, didn't raise his voice, didn't move at all. He just looked at Briggs with the calm, almost clinical attention of a man measuring distance, assessing capacity, and filing every word for later use. We'll be at the diner tomorrow, Cade said, and the day after that. Briggs stared at him for a long 3 seconds. Then he dropped money on the counter, didn't look at Evelyn, and walked out. The patrol car's engine started. Gravel popped under tires. Then silence. Evelyn was gripping the counter with both hands, knuckles white, breathing in shallow bursts. Cade could see the calculations running behind her eyes, the frantic mathematics of consequence. Briggs would tell Wade. Wade would know someone had been talking. Wade would come home and the questions would start, and the questions always ended the same way. He's going to tell him, she said. Not to Cade, to the air, to the unfairness of it. I know. You know. The words came out fractured, carrying an edge he hadn't heard from her before. Not anger exactly, but the bitter, exhausted cousin of anger that lives in people who have been let down so many times that even potential rescue feels like another form of danger. You know, and you did it anyway. You sat there and you said those things with the deputy right there, and now he's going to... She stopped. Her hand went to her ribs. The left side. The side she'd been guarding for 3 days. Her breath hitched in a way that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with pain. The specific, localized pain of something broken or cracked beneath the skin that the act of breathing aggravated. Evelyn, don't. She stepped back from the counter. Don't say my name like you're going to fix this. You can't fix this. You're going to ride out of here on your motorcycles, and I'm going to be standing in this kitchen tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and the only thing that will be different is that he'll be angrier, because someone noticed, and noticing makes him feel exposed. And when he feels exposed, She stopped again. Not because she chose to, but because continuing required describing what happened when Wade felt exposed. And the description lived in her body, not her words. The diner was silent. 14 bikers sat in their booths, and not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. Because the sound of a woman articulating the exact mechanics of her own captivity was a kind of violence that couldn't be answered with fists or engines or the well-intentioned promises of men who hadn't earned the right to make them yet. Cade stood slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket. Not for the photograph this time, for a napkin and a pen from the counter. He wrote a number, his cell, the prepaid one he carried for club business, and slid it across the counter toward her. That number works day or night. You don't have to use it. You don't have to trust me. But if the moment comes when you decide you want out, really want out, you call that number, and I promise you on the only thing I have left that matters, we will come. Evelyn looked at the napkin, looked at the number, looked at Cade, and in her eyes, something moved. Not trust, not hope, but the terrifying precursor to both. The crack in the wall that lets light through before the structure decides whether to hold or to fall. She took the napkin, folded it once, slid it into the pocket of her apron. Then the front door opened and the temperature in the room collapsed to absolute zero. Wade Turner stood in the doorway, back early, supply run cut short, a bag of groceries in one arm, and a face that told every person in that diner that Harlan Briggs drove fast and called faster. His eyes moved from the bikers to Evelyn to the counter to Cade and back to Evelyn, and the sequence of that gaze was a roadmap of priority. She was the first place he looked and the last place he returned to, and the return carried the weight of a verdict already rendered. Evie, he said. Just the name, just the diminutive he had chosen for her, the shortened version that removed 2 syllables and half her identity. Kitchen. Now. She moved, but this time, for the first time, she hesitated. One beat, one fraction of a second where her feet stayed planted and her hand drifted toward the apron pocket where the napkin sat folded around a phone number she had no safe way to dial. One fraction of a second where the choice was visible. Stay, go, obey, resist, written across her body in the language of muscles deciding whether to follow old instructions or new ones. Then she walked into the kitchen. The door swung shut, and Wade Turner turned to face Cade Mercer with something in his eyes that wasn't fear, wasn't anger, but the cold, calculating recognition of a man who had just identified a threat to his control and was already building the architecture of its destruction. "We need to talk," Wade said. "Outside." Cade rose from the stool. Every revenant in the room rose with him. The gravel lot outside the Silver Spoon was slick with freezing rain, and the sky above Black Hollow pressed down like a coffin lid. Low, gray, suffocating, the kind of sky that made you understand why mining towns died. Wade Turner stood 6 feet from the diner's entrance with the grocery bag still in his arm and his boots planted wide. The stance of a man defending ground he considered his. Behind Cade, the revenants fanned out in a half circle that wasn't a formation and wasn't an accident. The natural geometry of men who had been in enough situations to know where to stand without being told. Wade looked at them, counted them. 14 men in leather, rain beating on their shoulders, breath visible in the cold morning air. His jaw worked. The calculation behind his eyes was almost audible. The risk assessment of a man who controlled through intimidation, recalibrating in real time against a force he couldn't intimidate. "I don't want trouble," Wade said. The grocery bag shifted in his arm. His free hand hung at his side, fingers opening and closing in slow rhythm. "Then you're in luck," Cade replied, "because we're not trouble." "Harlan says different." "Harlan says what you tell him to say." The accusation landed in the wet air between them and stayed there, too heavy to dissipate. Wade's nostrils flared. The friendly local businessman mask slipped for a quarter of a second, just long enough for Cade to see the machinery underneath, the hard wiring of a man who had never been challenged on his own territory, and was encountering the sensation for the first time. "You don't know anything about this town," Wade said. "About me. About how things work here." "I know how Bruises work, same in every town." Wade stepped forward. One step. Deliberate. Testing. "You want to be careful about what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm looking at your waitress and I'm telling you what I see." "What you see is none of your business." "Made it my business." "Then unmake it. Get on your bikes, ride south like you told me 3 days ago, and forget this town exists, because if you don't—" Wade paused. The threat was forming behind his teeth, visible in the tension of his lips, in the forward lean of his body, in the primitive threat display of a man whose primary weapon was fear, and who was discovering that fear had a range, and these men were standing outside it. "If we don't—" "What?" Duke said from Cade's left. His prosthetic hand caught the gray light, metal and polymer, and the memory of an explosion that took everything below the wrist. "Finish the sentence." Wade looked at Duke, looked at the prosthetic, looked at the faces behind Cade. Scarred, weathered, still, the collective expression of men who had absorbed more violence than he could generate in a lifetime and were still standing. The threat died in his throat. He swallowed it, and the swallowing looked like it cost him something. "I'm going to talk to Roy," Wade said. Sheriff Gatlin. The name deployed like a weapon. Local authority, institutional power, the machinery of legitimacy that had protected Wade Turner for years. "And Roy's going to have a conversation with you about vagrancy and loitering and the kind of attention an outlaw motorcycle club brings to a quiet community. And then you're going to leave." Not because I asked, because the law asked. And the law in this county has a long memory for people who don't listen. He turned and walked back into the diner. The door slammed behind him. Through the rain-streaked window, Cade watched him disappear into the kitchen, and the swinging door banged shut. And somewhere behind it was Evelyn with a napkin in her apron pocket and a phone number she might never get the chance to use. "Clock's running," Roach said quietly. "He'll have the sheriff here by nightfall." Cade stood in the rain, not moving, letting the cold water run down his face and into the collar of his jacket. The revenants waited. They had learned years ago that Cade's silences were not absence but processing, the still surface of deep water moving beneath. "Duke," Cade said finally, "I need you to make some calls, not local, county level, state level, anyone who owes us, anyone who remembers a favor. I want to know everything about Wade Turner that isn't in the version he shows this town." "Looking for anything specific?" "Looking for the thing he's hiding. Men like him always have something bigger than what's in front of you. The diner, the waitress, the control, that's the surface. There's something underneath." Duke nodded and walked toward the motel without another word. Roach followed, already pulling the prepaid from his jacket. The other revenants mounted their bikes and the engines fired in sequence, each ignition a percussive statement that echoed off the storefronts of Black Hollow like artillery reports. They rode back to the mountain rest in formation, and the town watched from behind curtains and windshields, and the watching had a different quality now. Not curiosity, but wariness. The communal awareness that something was shifting in the ecosystem and the outcome was not yet determined. At the motel, Cade paced. Room 6 was 12 feet by 14 feet, and he covered its diagonal in 5 strides, turned, covered it again. The repetitive motion of a caged thing measuring the dimensions of its containment. The photograph of Lily lay on the nightstand. He didn't look at it. Didn't need to. The image was burned into his visual cortex. Her face, her doorway smile, the slow dimming that he mistook for growing up when it was actually something growing over her. Something consuming her from the inside while he stood outside and watched through glass he never bothered to break. Hours passed. The sleet intensified, coating the parking lot in a thin crystalline shell that crackled under boots. Duke was in room 8 with the landline pressed against his ear, speaking in the low, coded shorthand of a man working contacts who required discretion. Roach had driven 40 miles to the county seat and was sitting in a public library using their internet terminal, pulling records that small towns kept but didn't advertise. Moth was monitoring the police scanner he kept in his saddlebag, a habit from his years as a bail bondsman before the drinking got bad enough to end that career. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Duke knocked on Cade's door. Cade opened it. Duke's face told him everything before a single word was spoken. Something had surfaced. Something that changed the architecture of everything they thought they were dealing with. "Sit down," Duke said. "I'll stand." "Cade, sit down." Cade sat on the edge of the bed. Duke closed the door, leaned against it, and spoke in the flat, inflectionless tone he used when delivering information that couldn't be softened by delivery. "Wade Turner isn't just a diner owner who beats his waitress. He's a landowner, big one. Through 3 different shell companies, he owns 40% of the commercial property in Black Hollow. The diner, the gas station building, not the business, just the building, the old hardware store, the lot where the feed supply used to be, and 12 residential parcels on the east side of town." Cade stared at him. "A man who runs a diner in a dying mining town doesn't own 40% of anything. He does if the money comes from somewhere else. I called Jennings, remember him, ran bonds in Raleigh before he went straight, and he pulled the incorporation records on those shell companies. 2 of them trace back to a holding group out of Charlotte called Meridian Peak Partners. Jennings couldn't crack the ownership structure all the way, but he found one name on the board of directors that made his stomach turn." Duke paused. Not for effect, because the next sentence was going to alter everything. "Victor Langley." The name hit Cade like a fist to the chest. He didn't move, didn't blink. The room shrank around him until there was nothing in it except that name and the 17 years of wreckage attached to it. Victor Langley. Real estate developer. Political fundraiser. The kind of man who moved through power structures the way water moves through pipes. Invisibly, consistently, touching everything without leaving fingerprints. Cade knew the name because every revenant knew the name. Because Victor Langley was the man who had bankrolled Marcus Cole's legal defense when Marcus was arrested for assaulting Lily. Victor Langley was the man whose attorney got Marcus released on bail in under 4 hours. Victor Langley was the man whose money and connections and quiet systemic influence had kept Marcus Cole free and functional, while Lily Mercer died 3 months later from injuries that the system decided were accidental. Victor Langley was the reason Cade's sister was in the ground. "That's not all," Duke said. His voice had dropped even lower, as if the information itself required containment. "Roach called 20 minutes ago from the county library. He pulled property tax records going back 10 years. Meridian Peak has been buying up Black Hollow piece by piece since 2019, and 6 months ago they filed a preliminary development application with the County Planning Commission for something called the Hollow Ridge Resort and Conference Center, $42 million project, luxury hotel, golf course, spa complex, right here, right on top of this town." Cade's hands were on his knees, gripping, the tendons standing out like bridge cables. His breathing was controlled, too controlled, the deliberate regulation of a man containing an internal detonation. "Wade Turner is Langley's man on the ground," Duke continued. "He's been buying property for years, driving out tenants, letting buildings decay, creating the conditions for the town to die so Langley can buy the corpse for pennies and build his resort on the bones. And Evelyn? Evelyn is an accident. She's a woman who walked into Wade's orbit and got trapped. And Wade keeps her the same way he keeps everything else in this town. Through control, through isolation, through making sure nobody looks too closely at what's underneath." Cade stood. The motion was violent, not directed at anyone, just the physical expression of a rage so compressed it had to move through his body or detonate inside it. He walked to the wall, pressed both palms flat against it, and stood there with his head bowed, breathing into the plaster, the muscles across his back trembling under his jacket. "He's here," Cade said. The words came through clenched teeth. "Langley. He's connected to this." Langley's connected to a lot of things. That's how he operates. He never touches anything directly. He finds men like Wade, local men, controllable men, men with just enough cruelty to do the groundwork. And he moves through them like a puppet master working strings from another room. And nobody's caught it. Nobody's looked. Black Hollow doesn't have a newspaper. The County Planning Commission held one public hearing on the resort application and 3 people showed up. This town is dying, Cade. It's been dying for decades. And when a town is dying, nobody questions the vultures because at least the vultures are paying attention. Cade pushed off the wall, turned. His face had changed. The grief was still there, and the rage. But they had been joined by something colder, something structural, the expression of a man who had just discovered that the thing he came here to do and the thing he had been carrying for 17 years were the same thing. "Get everyone in room 8, he said. Now." 20 minutes later, 14 men sat in a room that smelled like wet leather, cigarette smoke, and the particular ozone scent of adrenaline being metabolized. Cade stood at the center, and when he spoke, his voice carried the flat authority of a briefing officer delivering intelligence that would change the shape of an operation. He told them about Victor Langley, about Meridian Peak Partners, about the shell companies, the property acquisitions, the resort development that was designed to consume Black Hollow, and everything in it. He told them about the connection to Marcus Cole and Lily's death, the money, the lawyers, the system that had protected a killer and called it justice. He told them about Wade Turner's role as Langley's local asset, the man on the ground executing a strategy that required a town to die so that a rich man could build on its grave. When he finished, the room was silent for a long time. The kind of silence that has weight and texture, that you can feel pressing against your eardrums. Preacher spoke first. "This changes things. This changes everything," Cade said. "I mean, it changes what we're dealing with. Wade Turner alone is a local problem. One man, one diner, one corrupt deputy. Wade Turner backed by Victor Langley and a $42 million development project is a systemic problem. Langley has lawyers. Langley has connections in state government. Langley has the kind of money that makes problems disappear, and right now, we are the problem." "We've been problems before," Roach said from the floor. "Not like this. This isn't a bar fight or a territory dispute. This is organized money operating through legitimate channels with law enforcement alignment. If we push Wade, Langley pushes back with resources we can't match. So we don't push Wade, Cade said. We expose him. With what? Property records and a development application? That's public information. It's not illegal to buy land in a dying town. It's illegal to use a shell company to conceal ownership while manipulating property values through deliberate neglect. It's illegal to coordinate with local law enforcement to suppress complaints. And it's damn sure illegal to keep a woman captive through financial control and physical violence while the man responsible for your sister's death signs your checks. That last part wasn't legal. It was personal. And every man in the room heard the distinction. And every man understood that the legal argument and the personal argument were now woven together in Cade's mind like two strands of the same rope, and separating them would require a kind of surgical precision that grief had made impossible. Hound, the former Navy corpsman, raised his hand, an unconscious military gesture he'd never fully shed. There's a medical angle. If I can document Evelyn's injuries, photographs, written assessment, dates, that's evidence of ongoing domestic violence that local law enforcement failed to address. That goes to state police, not county. That bypasses Briggs and Gatlin entirely. She has to consent, Preacher said. She has to be alive to consent, Cade said, and the brutality of the logic silenced the room. Moth, who had been monitoring the police scanner, pulled the earpiece out and looked up. Something else. Briggs has been on the radio all afternoon. 3 calls to the sheriff's personal line. 2 to a number I don't recognize, Roach. Can you run a reverse lookup when you're back at the library? And 1 to what sounded like a dispatcher in the next county requesting information on a motorcycle club called the Iron Revenants. They're building a file on us. How fast? Duke asked. Fast enough. If Gatlin decides he wants us out, he can manufacture a pretext by tomorrow. Vagrancy, noise complaint, public safety concern. Pick one. Small-town sheriff with a cooperative deputy and a judge who golfs with the mayor can issue a dispersal order before we finish our morning coffee. The walls of room 8 seemed to close in another inch. The revenants were trained for many things: combat, endurance, the specific kind of suffering that comes from being unwanted in every town you pass through, but they were not trained for legal warfare waged by millionaires through municipal bureaucracy. They were a fist, and the enemy was fog, and you cannot punch fog no matter how hard you swing. We need outside help, Duke said. Legal help. Someone who can look at Langley's structure and find the cracks. I know someone, Moth said. Beckett Greer. Used to be a forensic accountant for the state attorney general's office before he got pushed out for being too good at his job. He's in Asheville now, does independent consulting. Owes me a favor from the Knoxville situation 3 years back. Call him, Cade said. Tonight. And Evelyn? Preacher asked. The question cut through the strategic discussion and landed squarely in the human center of everything. Plans and tactics and legal maneuvers were tools, but the woman standing behind a diner counter with cracked ribs and a folded napkin in her pocket was the reason any of it mattered. Cade walked to the window. Outside, full dark had fallen on Black Hollow, and the town looked like what it was, a place where the lights were going out one by one and nobody was replacing the bulbs. The Mountain Rest's neon sign flickered vacancy in pink letters that buzzed with electrical fatigue. In the distance, barely visible through the snow, the Silver Spoon second-floor window glowed with the same dim light he had watched 3 nights ago. The same window. The same woman. The same trap. She took the number, Cade said. That means something. It means she put a piece of paper in her pocket. It doesn't mean she'll call. She'll call. How do you know? Because I saw her hesitate. When Wade told her to go to the kitchen, she hesitated. 1 second, maybe less. But she hesitated, and that hesitation is the first crack in 3 years of obedience. Once the crack is there, it doesn't close. It just waits for enough pressure to split open. The room absorbed this. Outside, an engine started somewhere in town. Not a Harley, something smaller, a car, or truck. And the sound traveled through the cold air with the clarity that only winter provides, when the atmosphere is too thin to muffle anything and every noise arrives with surgical precision. Roach stood up from the floor, joints popping, his massive frame unfolding like construction equipment. I'm going back out. There's a bar on the county road, Donnelly's, about 4 miles east. Small-town bars are where information lives. Guys talk after 3 drinks. They talk about their neighbors, their bosses, their frustrations. If Wade Turner has enemies in this town, and every man like him does, they'll be at that bar. Take Moth, Cade said. 2 is enough. Don't draw attention. Roach and Moth left. Their bikes fired in the parking lot, the sound splitting the night, and then the rumble faded as they headed east on the county road, and the motel settled back into its cold, buzzing silence. Cade sat alone in room 6. The others had dispersed to their rooms, and the motel was quiet except for the tick of sleet against windows and the occasional murmur of Duke's voice through the wall as he worked the landline. Cade held Lily's photograph in both hands, studying it with the intensity of a man reading a map to a place he couldn't reach. 17 years. 17 years of carrying her face in his pocket and her death in his chest, and the specific surgical guilt of a brother who came home from war only to discover that the enemy was already inside the house. And now the man who had made that possible, not Marcus, not the hand that struck, but the machine that protected the hand, was connected to this town, to this diner, to another woman standing in the same trajectory of the same violence that had ended his sister's life. The coincidence was too precise to be random and too cruel to be designed. It simply was, the way wreckage is. The way the universe arranges its damage without explanation and leaves the survivors to find meaning in the rubble or go mad from the absence of it. His phone buzzed at 9:40. Unknown number. He answered on the second ring. Is this? A woman's voice, thin, shaking, barely above a whisper. Background noise, running water, the hiss of a faucet turned on to mass conversation. Is this the number from the napkin? Cade's grip on the phone tightened. Evelyn. I can't talk long, he's downstairs. I turned on the shower so he'd think. A pause. Heavy breathing. The sound of someone trying to be quiet while their body was doing everything it could to be loud, to gasp, to cry, to scream. He knows someone said something to Harlan. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He came home and She stopped. The silence was worse than words. How bad? Cade asked. His voice was steady, clinically steady. The steadiness of a man who understood that his emotions were useless to her right now and only his calm had value. I can't breathe right. The left side. It was already from before. And he hit the same place, and now I can't. Can you get to the door? No, he locked it from outside. He does that when he. Another pause. A small sound that might have been a sob compressed into something smaller and harder, the way coal becomes diamond under enough pressure. He does that when he's angry, locks the door, goes downstairs, comes back in an hour. You have less than an hour. I know. Is there a window? Second floor. Fire escape is rusted. I don't know if it. Can you reach it? I think so, but if he hears me. Evelyn, listen to me. Cade was on his feet, already pulling on his boots with one hand, phone pressed between shoulder and ear. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need the real answer. Not the one you've been giving everyone for 3 years. The real one. Silence. Water running. Breath. Do you want out? The question filled the distance between them. The phone signal, the night air, the miles of frozen road and broken streetlight, an institutional failure that separated a woman locked in a room from a man lacing his boots in a motel. It filled all of it and left no space for anything except the answer. Yes. The word came out like something being torn from her body, not spoken, extracted. Yes, I want out. I want out tonight. I can't. He said things tonight about making sure I never leave, about making sure nobody finds. He said things I've never heard him say before, and I believe him. I believe all of it. Cade was already out the door. Room 8, fist on the wood. The door opened and Duke stood there, shirtless, the scars from Fallujah mapping his torso like a second alphabet. Now, Cade said. That was all. Duke didn't ask. He turned and started pulling on his gear. Cade knocked on room 4. Preacher opened it. Cade's face said everything. Preacher grabbed his jacket. Room 3. Hound, already dressed because he never fully undressed. A corpsman's habit of being ready. Room 9. Calico and Bowie, veterans who slept light and dressed fast. In 4 minutes, 8 revenants stood in the parking lot of the Mountain Rest Motel in the freezing dark, breath clouding, leather creaking, the quiet urgency of men transitioning from rest to operation without the need for speeches or explanations. They didn't start the bikes, the sound would carry. Instead, they moved on foot, walking through the snow-dusted streets of Black Hollow in 2 columns, boots crunching on ice, the only sound in a town that was too dead to notice and too complicit to help. The Silver Spoon was dark on the ground floor. The neon sign was off. Wade's Silver Dodge sat in the gravel lot, engine cold, snow accumulating on the hood. Upstairs, the bathroom window glowed faintly. Evelyn's signal, the shower still running, the sound of water covering the sound of a woman deciding to live. Kate assessed the building with the reflexive tactical eye of a man who had cleared structures in places where the structures were trying to kill him. Front entrance, locked, visible from upstairs too loud. Back entrance, kitchen door, possibly unlocked. Wade might be in the kitchen. Fire escape, east side of the building, 2nd floor, rusted but potentially functional. Hound, you're with me on the fire escape. Duke, Preacher? Back door. If Wade comes out, you hold him. Don't engage, just hold. And if he doesn't come out? Preacher asked. Then we get Evelyn down and gone before he knows the door's open. They moved. The revenants split with the silent efficiency of a unit that had trained together for years, each man finding his position without instruction because the positions were obvious to anyone who understood the geometry of extraction. Duke and Preacher disappeared around the back of the building. Calico and Bowie took the front lot, positioning themselves between the diner entrance and Wade's truck. Kate and Hound reached the fire escape. It was old iron, bolted to the brick, rust bleeding from every joint. Cade tested the first rung with his weight. It groaned, but held. He went up. Each step produced a metallic complaint that sounded enormous in the frozen silence. But the shower was still running inside, and the sound of water covered the sound of iron and the sound of a man climbing toward a window where a woman was waiting to be told that escape was real. He reached the 2nd floor platform. The bathroom window was frosted glass, cracked open an inch at the bottom. He pressed his face to the gap. Evelyn. A gasp. Movement. The window opened wider, and her face appeared, swollen, tear-streaked, a cut above her left eyebrow that was still bleeding sluggishly, her left arm held tight against her ribs in the posture of someone protecting something broken beneath the skin. "Can you fit through?" Kate asked. She looked at the window frame, looked at her body, looked at the fire escape, rusted and trembling under Cade's weight. Behind her, through the bathroom door, the apartment was dark and the sound of a television floated up from the 1st floor. Wade, downstairs, the hour not yet elapsed, the lock still engaged, the cage still sealed from the outside. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know, come through anyway." Hound appeared on the platform beside Cade, medical kit slung across his back, and when Evelyn saw the second man, her body tensed. The involuntary recoil of a woman whose experience had taught her that more men meant more danger. Hound read it instantly. "I'm a medic," he said. Quiet. Professional. The voice he used with casualties in the field, designed to cut through panic and find the part of the brain that still processed information. "I'm going to help you down. You're going to put your weight on me, not the railing. Can you do that?" She nodded. One small movement. Then she turned sideways, threaded her legs through the window frame, and Cade caught the sound she made when her ribs compressed against the sill. A short, bitten-off cry that she swallowed with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to make pain silent. Hound took her weight. Cade steadied the railing. The fire escape shuddered and groaned, and for one terrible second Cade felt the bolt shift in the brick, the whole structure threatening to separate from the wall and send all 3 of them into the alley below. But it held. The way old things sometimes hold, not because they're strong, but because they're stubborn. Because they've been standing so long that falling requires more energy than staying. They reached the ground. Evelyn's feet touched the frozen earth of the alley behind the Silver Spoon, and for a moment she just stood there, breathing, her face turned up toward the dark sky, her eyes closed, snow falling on her cheeks and melting into the tears that were already there. The look on her face was not relief. Relief comes later. This was something more primal, the look of an animal that has escaped a trap and is still feeling the phantom pressure of the jaws. "We need to move," Cade said, gently. But the gentleness had iron under it. They moved. Through the alley, past the dumpsters and the stacked crates of empty bottles that clattered in the wind, toward the street where Duke and Preacher were already waiting. The group reformed around Evelyn, not surrounding her, not caging her, but forming a corridor of bodies between her and every direction that danger could arrive from. They walked through Black Hollow's empty streets, and the town slept or pretended to sleep, and the only sounds were boots on frozen ground and Evelyn's labored breathing and the distant, almost subliminal creak of the fire escape settling back against the wall like a witness trying to pretend it hadn't seen anything. They were 2 blocks from the motel when headlights swept across the intersection ahead. A patrol car. Black and white. Light bar dark but engine running, rolling slow through the streets of Black Hollow, in the way patrol cars roll when they're not responding to a call but looking for something specific. Deputy Harlan Briggs. Midnight patrol. Or midnight surveillance. Same thing in this town. The revenants pressed against the wall of a shuttered hardware store, bodies flat against cold brick. Evelyn between Cade and Hound, her breath coming in ragged gasps that she was trying to muffle with her hand against her mouth. The headlights swept past. The cruiser rolled through the intersection, brake lights flaring once at the stop sign, then continuing east toward the county road. They waited 30 seconds, a minute, then moved again, faster now, the urgency overriding caution because every minute Evelyn was outside that apartment was a minute closer to Wade checking the lock and finding it still engaged but the room behind it empty. The mountain rest materialized out of the dark, like a bunker. They entered through the back, avoiding the front office where Carl Jessup might still be awake and might talk to the wrong person tomorrow. Room 6, Cade's room. The door closed and the lock engaged, and Evelyn Cross stood in the middle of a motel room surrounded by men in leather jackets, shaking so violently that Hound guided her to the bed before her legs gave out. He examined her, carefully, clinically, asking permission before every touch, narrating every action, maintaining the verbal transparency that trauma-informed care demanded, because surprising a woman who had been beaten by a man's hands with unexpected contact from another man's hands was a cruelty that would undo everything they had just accomplished. 2 cracked ribs on the left side, previously injured and re-aggravated. The cut above her eyebrow needed butterfly closures, not stitches, which was fortunate because Hound's field kit could manage one, but not the other. Bruising across both forearms consistent with defensive posturing, a deep contusion on her right hip that she hadn't mentioned, and he only found because she winced when she shifted position on the bed. "You need a hospital," Hound said. "These ribs need imaging, if one of them is displaced." "No hospital," Evelyn said. "Wade knows people at the county ER. Admissions staff. He'll be called within an hour. There are hospitals in Asheville." "Asheville," she repeated. The word again. The theoretical city. The cousin she'd lost touch with. The destination that existed on the other end of a 4-hour highway she had never been allowed to travel. Cade crouched in front of her, not looming, not standing over, crouching, so his eyes were level with hers. So the power differential that her life had been built around was physically reduced to 0. "We can get you to Asheville," he said, "tonight. But you need to understand something first, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it because you deserve the truth more than you deserve comfort." She looked at him, waiting. The shaking hadn't stopped, but her eyes were focused, clear, sharp. The eyes of a woman who was processing information at combat speed because her survival depended on it. Wade Turner works for a man named Victor Langley. Langley is a developer who's been buying up Black Hollow through shell companies to build a resort. Wade is his local operator, buying property, maintaining control, making sure nobody asks questions. This means Wade is not acting alone. This means the resources behind him are bigger than a diner and a deputy. And this means that when he discovers you're gone, he's not just going to be angry, he's going to be scared. Because a scared Wade Turner might talk about things Langley doesn't want talked about, and Langley will do whatever it takes to prevent that. "You're saying I'm not just running from Wade?" I'm saying the world you're running from is bigger than the room you were locked in. And I'm saying it because you need to make your choice knowing the full shape of what you're choosing. Evelyn stared at him. The snow outside was thickening, visible through the thin curtain, accumulating on the window ledge in a white line that grew while they spoke. Her hands were in her lap, still trembling, fingers laced together like she was holding herself to herself. Your sister, she said. The man who... The money that protected him. That was Langley? Yes. And you didn't know he was connected to Black Hollow until today? No. So this isn't just about me. Cade held her gaze. The honesty required was brutal, but she had asked for it and he owed it. It's about you. It's also about her. I can't separate them. I'm not going to pretend I can. Evelyn nodded slowly. Not in agreement. In recognition. The recognition that the man offering to save her was carrying his own wreckage into the operation, and that his wreckage and her wreckage were knotted together by a name neither of them had known about until hours ago. And the knot made everything more complicated and more dangerous and more human. Outside, the sound of an engine. Not a patrol car this time. A truck. Wade's silver Dodge. Moving through the streets of Black Hollow, headlights cutting through the snow, hunting. He had found the empty apartment. He had found the open window. And now he was looking for the woman who had, for the first time in 3 years, chosen to leave. Cade moved to the window, pressed his back against the wall beside it, peered through the edge of the curtain. The Dodge rolled past the motel. Slowly, hunting speed, high beams sweeping the parking lot where 14 Harley-Davidsons sat in a row covered in fresh snow. The truck stopped. Brake lights painted the snow red. Then it reversed, pulled into the Mountain Rest's lot. The engine died. A door opened. Boots hit gravel. And then a second sound. Another engine, another vehicle, pulling in behind Wade's truck. The patrol car. Briggs. Called in, deployed, the machinery of local power mobilizing in real time against a motel full of bikers who had just extracted the one thing Wade Turner could not afford to lose. Not because he loved her, because she was inside his system, and people inside systems know things about those systems. And a woman with cracked ribs and a story to tell was the most dangerous thing in Victor Langley's $42 million world. Cade looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Cade. And in the space between them, in the thin electric air of a motel room that smelled like wet leather and antiseptic and the ozone of adrenaline, the full weight of what they had started settled on both of them with the finality of a door slamming shut. There was no going back. Not for her, not for him, not for any of them. Wade Turner's fist hit the motel's front office door hard enough to rattle the frame, and the sound echoed across the Mountain Rest parking lot like the opening shot of a war that had been building for 17 years. Carl Jessup opened the front office door in a bathrobe and slippers, blinking against the snow and the flashlight that Harlan Briggs shoved into his face. Behind Briggs, Wade Turner stood with his jacket open and his chest heaving, the controlled facade of the small-town businessman stripped away to reveal the machinery underneath. A man running on rage and fear in equal measure, the two chemicals mixing in his blood like fuel and oxidizer. "Which room?" Wade said. Not to Carl, through Carl. What? It's midnight. I can't just... Which room are they in, Carl? Carl's eyes bounced between Wade and the deputy and the badge and the gun and the parking lot full of motorcycles that suddenly looked less like customer vehicles and more like evidence in something he didn't want to be part of. His mouth worked. No sound came out. Briggs stepped forward. The badge caught the neon vacancy light and threw pink reflections across the snow. Mr. Jessup, we have reason to believe a missing person may be on these premises. We need to conduct a welfare check. You can cooperate voluntarily, or I can contact Sheriff Gatlin and have a warrant within the hour. The lie was smooth, professional, the kind of lie that small-town law enforcement practiced until it became indistinguishable from procedure. There was no missing person report. There was no basis for a warrant. There was just Wade Turner's rage channeled through his cousin's badge, the way it had always been channeled, through systems, through institutions, through the quiet cooperation of men who found it easier to enable than to question. Carl Jessup swallowed. Room 6. But I don't want any... Wade was already moving. Briggs followed. Their boots crunched across the frozen parking lot, past the line of snow-covered Harleys, toward the door of room 6, where a thin line of light leaked beneath the frame. Inside, Cade had been listening. He stood with his back against the door, one hand on the deadbolt, the other flat against the wood, feeling the vibrations of approaching footsteps through the grain. Evelyn sat on the bed behind him, Hound at her side, the medical kit still open. Her face was white, not from cold, from the sound of Wade's voice carrying through the winter air. A voice that her nervous system recognized the way a dog recognizes a shock collar's frequency, with total, cellular, involuntary terror. "He's here," she said. "I know. He'll break down the door." "No, he won't." The footsteps stopped outside. A fist hit the door. 3 heavy impacts that shook the deadbolt in its housing. "Open this door." Wade's voice. Compressed. The pressure cooker register that Evelyn knew preceded the worst of it. Cade didn't open the door. He spoke through it, his mouth close to the wood, his voice carrying the flat, toneless calm of a man who had taken fire in places where panic meant death, and had trained himself to respond to crisis the way a machine responds to input, without hesitation, without emotion, without the wasted energy of fear. "Walk away, Wade. You've got my property in there." The word hit the room like a slap. Property, not girlfriend, not partner, not even employee. Property. The designation was so naked, so reflexively honest, that it revealed the entire architecture of Wade Turner's psychology in a single syllable. Evelyn was not a person to him. She was an asset, a possession, something that belonged to his system and had been removed without authorization. "Nobody's property in here," Cade said. "Just people. Open the door or Harlan opens it for you." Outside, Briggs shifted on the gravel. His hand went to his holster, not drawing but resting, the preliminary gesture of a man preparing to escalate beyond conversation. He was nervous. The nervousness was audible in his breathing, visible in the vapor clouds coming too fast and too shallow from his mouth. This was beyond his operational comfort zone. Harlan Briggs could handle traffic stops, drunk and disorderlies, the occasional domestic call that he resolved by telling the woman to calm down and the man to take a walk. He could not handle 14 outlaw bikers and an extraction operation and a cousin whose rage was escalating beyond the containment protocols that kept their arrangement functional. "Wade," Briggs said, low, a warning. "Let me handle this." "Handle it then." Briggs cleared his throat, raised his voice. "This is Deputy Briggs, Black Hollow Sheriff's Department. We're conducting a welfare check on Evelyn Cross. Open the door and let us confirm she's safe, and this doesn't have to go any further." Inside, Hound looked at Cade. "Welfare check. That's his play. If she says she's fine, they have no reason to enter. If she doesn't answer, they'll claim exigent circumstances." Cade looked at Evelyn. The question was in his eyes, not his mouth. "What do you want to do?" Because the moment belonged to her, not to him, and every choice from this point forward had to be hers, or the rescue became just another form of captivity. Evelyn stared at the door. Behind it stood the man who had broken her ribs, locked her in rooms, monitored her phone, controlled her money, and systematically dismantled every connection she had to the outside world until he was the only thing left. Behind it stood the deputy who had driven to her home 11 months ago, spoken to Wade on the porch for 20 minutes, and driven away while she stood inside with 2 broken fingers and the certain knowledge that the system designed to protect her had decided she wasn't worth the paperwork. She stood up from the bed. Hound reached for her arm, a medic's reflex, concern for the ribs, but she shook him off, walked to the door, stood beside Cade. "I'm here, Harlan," she said. Her voice trembled but didn't break. "I left on my own. I'm not going back." Silence outside. Snow ticking against metal and glass. Then Wade's voice, and the change in it was seismic, the rage modulating into something worse, something softer and more dangerous, the honeyed register of a manipulator switching tactics. "Evie, baby, whatever these people told you, whatever they convinced you of, this isn't who you are. You're confused. You're upset. Come home and we'll talk about it. Just come home." Evelyn's hand went to her ribs, the cracked ones, the ones he'd hit twice. Her fingers pressed against the injury through her shirt, and the pain seemed to anchor her, a physical reminder that cut through the fog of manipulation and habit and the deeply grooved neural pathways that 3 years of control had carved into her brain. "I'm not confused," she said, stronger now, the trembling receding into something harder. "I'm hurt. You hurt me. You've been hurting me, and I'm done." The words hung in the cold air on both sides of the door. Inside, Cade felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. Not relief, not victory, but the particular gravity of a moment that cannot be undone. Evelyn had spoken, out loud, to witnesses. The truth was no longer contained inside the walls of an apartment above a diner. It was loose in the world now, and it could not be recaptured. Wade understood this too. The silence outside was the silence of a man recalculating, realizing that the situation had moved beyond retrieval into damage control, and damage control meant something different. When your system was connected to Victor Langley's $42 million development, and the woman who just declared herself free had been inside that system long enough to know where the seams were. "Harlan," Wade said. The manipulator voice was gone. Something colder had replaced it. "Get them out." "Wade, I can't just—" "Get them out." The deadbolt rattled. Briggs was testing it, his hand on the knob, the muscle memory of authority overriding the part of his brain that was telling him this was wrong. This was beyond his jurisdiction. This was the kind of situation that ended careers and sometimes ended worse. The door to room 8 opened across the parking lot. Duke stepped out. Then Preacher. Then Calico, Bowie, Moth, and 3 others who had been waiting in the dark, listening through the walls, geared and ready. They fanned across the lot in the same half-circle formation they had used outside the diner, except now it was midnight, and the snow was falling, and the only light came from the motel's dying neon and the headlights of Briggs's patrol car, and in that light the iron revenants looked exactly like what they were, a wall of scarred, exhausted, unflinching men who had decided that this was the ground they would hold. Briggs turned, saw them. His hand tightened on his holster. The arithmetic of the situation was devastating. 1 deputy against 10 bikers, with his cousin standing behind him demanding action that the deputy's body and training and survival instincts were screaming was impossible. "This doesn't have to go bad," Duke said. He stood at the front of the group, prosthetic hand glinting in the neon light, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded men in actual combat and understood the difference between posturing and force projection. "Nobody here wants violence, but that woman said she's not going back, and that's the end of it." "You're interfering with a law enforcement action," Briggs said. His voice cracked on the last word. "There is no law enforcement action. There's no report filed. There's no warrant. There's no probable cause. What there is, deputy, is a man banging on a motel room door at midnight trying to drag a woman back to a place where she's been beaten, and a badge standing beside him calling it procedure. You want to explain that to a judge? A real judge? Not whoever Wade plays golf with on the weekends?" Briggs's mouth opened and closed. The snow fell on his hat brim and melted. His hand hovered near his weapon but didn't draw, because drawing meant committing, and committing against 10 armed veterans in a motel parking lot meant consequences that Harlan Briggs was not prepared to face. Not for Wade, not for anyone. "Wade," Briggs said. His voice had changed. The professional tone had fractured, revealing the frightened, overwhelmed man underneath. "We need to go." "The hell we do." "Wade, we need to go. Now." Wade Turner looked at the revenants, looked at the door of room 6 where Evelyn's voice had emerged declaring her freedom, looked at the snow accumulating on everything, covering everything, making the world white and new in a way that felt like mockery. His fists clenched at his sides, and the rage in his body was so compressed, so dense, that it seemed to generate its own heat. The snow near his boots melting slightly, steam rising from his jacket. The physical manifestation of a man whose control over another person had just been publicly severed and whose entire psychological structure was built on that control the way a building is built on a foundation. Remove the foundation, and the building doesn't just fall, it collapses inward, violently, taking everything inside it down. "This isn't over," Wade said. To Cade, to the door, to Evelyn behind it, to everyone. "You don't know what you've done. You don't know who you're dealing with. He turned and walked to his truck. Briggs followed, almost running, the relief of retreat visible in every step. The truck engine started. The patrol car started. Both reversed out of the lot, tires spinning on ice, headlights sweeping the snow-covered Harleys one last time before the vehicles disappeared down the county road, and the mountain rest motels settled into a silence so complete it felt like the inside of a held breath. Duke let the silence hold for 5 seconds. Then he said, "We've got maybe 4 hours before he comes back with more than a deputy." Kate opened the door of room 6, looked at the revenants, looked at the snow, looked at the road that ran through Black Hollow and connected to highways that led to places where women with cracked ribs could see real doctors and sleep in rooms that nobody locked from the outside. "We don't have 4 hours," Cade said. "We have now." The next 90 minutes moved with the grim efficiency of an evacuation. Hound stabilized Evelyn's ribs with a compression wrap from his kit, tight enough to support but loose enough to breathe, a balance he had learned on bodies in worse condition in places far more dangerous than a motel room in Appalachia. Moth was on the phone with Beckett Greer in Asheville, the forensic accountant, waking him from sleep with information that woke him completely. Meridian Peak Partners, Victor Langley, shell companies purchasing a dying town. Greer's voice went from groggy to alert to something that sounded almost hungry, the voice of a man who had been pushed out of the Attorney General's office for asking too many questions and had been waiting years for someone to ask him to ask them again. "I need 48 hours, Greer said through the phone's speaker. "Maybe less. If the shell company filings are as sloppy as you're describing, I can have a preliminary report ready for the State Attorney General's office by Thursday. But I need documentation. Property records, tax filings, anything that shows the pattern of acquisition and the connection to Langley." "Roach has most of it," Moth said. "Pulled it from the county library. He's digitizing it now." "Good. Send everything. And keep that woman safe. If she's been living inside Wade Turner's operation for 3 years, she may know things she doesn't even realize she knows. Financial details. Conversations overheard, names, dates, the kind of granular information that turns a development fraud case into a RICO investigation." The word hung in the room. RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations. The legal weapon that turned local crimes into federal cases and local criminals into federal defendants. The word that made men like Victor Langley lose sleep because their entire business model was built on the assumption that nobody would connect the dots. And RICO was the tool specifically designed to connect dots. Evelyn, wrapped in a blanket on the bed, listened to all of it. Her face had changed over the past hour. The drowning look was receding, replaced by something more alert, more present, the expression of a woman who was slowly realizing that her suffering was not isolated, but was a single thread in a much larger fabric, and that pulling that thread might unravel something enormous. "I heard things," she said. The room went quiet. "At night, Wade made calls. He thought I was asleep or he didn't care. He talked to someone. I never heard the name. About timelines. About getting the last properties before spring. About a meeting in Charlotte with investors. He kept files in the diner's basement. Paper files, not digital. He said once that digital was traceable in paper burns." Cade crouched in front of her. "The basement. Can you describe it?" "Locked room behind the walk-in cooler. He carries the key. But there's a spare in the kitchen, taped behind the fire extinguisher. I saw him put it there." The information electrified the room. Paper files, documentation of a development fraud scheme that connected a local diner owner to a statewide developer through shell companies and property manipulation. The kind of evidence that Beckett Greer could turn into a legal weapon and that Victor Langley would do anything to destroy. "We need those files," Duke said. "We need to get Evelyn to Asheville first," Preacher countered. "She's the priority. Files don't bleed." "Files burn," Cade said. "Wade's scared. Scared men destroy evidence. If we wait until Evelyn's safe in Asheville and then come back for the files, there won't be files to come back for." The tension between the two imperatives, Evelyn's safety versus the evidence, split the room like a fault line. Both were critical. Both were urgent. And the revenants were 14 men with limited resources in a hostile town with a corrupt sheriff's office and a millionaire developer whose money could reach places their motorcycles couldn't. "We split," Cade said. The decision came with the same flat authority he used for all decisions. Not democratic, not dictatorial, but the voice of a man who had weighed the options faster than group discussion would allow and was willing to carry the consequences. Roach, Moth, Hound, you take Evelyn to Asheville. Tonight. Now. Take the back roads, avoid the county highway, don't stop until you're at Greer's office. Hound monitors her medical condition. Moth coordinates with Greer. Roach drives Point. In what? Roach asked. She can't ride a Harley with cracked ribs. Cade turned to the window. In the parking lot, between the motorcycles and the motel office, sat Carl Jessup's personal vehicle, a 10-year-old Ford Explorer with rust on the quarter panels and a county inspection sticker that was 3 months expired. Moth, go talk to Carl. Buy his truck. He won't sell. He will when you offer him 4 times what it's worth in cash. The club fund covers it. Moth left. 3 minutes later, the sound of negotiation drifted across the lot. Moth's reasonable voice, Carl's panicked stammering, the rustle of bills being counted. 5 minutes after that, Moth returned with keys. They moved Evelyn to the Explorer. Hound helped her into the back seat, propping her left side with rolled blankets, the field medic's instinct for patient transport converting a civilian vehicle into an improvised ambulance. Roach took the wheel. Moth rode shotgun with his phone already dialing Greer's number. The Explorer's engine coughed, caught, and settled into a rattling idle that sounded like a smoker's breathing. Cade leaned into the driver's window. Roach, no stops. No stops. Roach's face was stone, the face of a man who had transported wounded through worse conditions in worse vehicles in worse places. She'll be there by dawn. Call me when you arrive. The Explorer reversed out of the lot, headlights cutting through the snow, and disappeared east on the county road that led to the highway that led to Asheville, that led to safety. Cade watched the taillights until they were swallowed by the dark and the snow and the distance, and then he turned to the remaining 11 revenants standing in the parking lot of the Mountain Rest Motel at 1:40 in the morning in a freezing Appalachian town that had just become the most dangerous place any of them had been since the wars they came home from. The diner, Cade said. We get those files before Wade gets there first. They rode. 11 Harleys through the dead streets of Black Hollow, engines rolling low, the sound bouncing off shuttered storefronts and empty lots and the hills that surrounded the town like the walls of a prison. No headlights. They rode by the amber glow of broken streetlights and the gray luminance of snow on the ground, the way they had ridden in formation through places that didn't appear on maps, where light meant targeting and silence meant survival. The Silver Spoon sat dark and locked on the main road. Wade's truck was not in the lot. Briggs's patrol car was not on the street. The absence felt deliberate. Not an opportunity, but a trap, the space where an ambush would live if someone were setting one. But Cade had survived ambushes in places designed specifically for killing, and the geometry of the Silver Spoon's parking lot did not suggest hostility. It suggested emptiness. The building had been abandoned in the panic of Wade's departure and not yet reclaimed. Duke picked the kitchen's back door lock in 40 seconds, a skill acquired in Fallujah and refined over a decade of club operations that sometimes required access to places that weren't technically available. The door opened into darkness, and the smell of cold grease, stale coffee, and the particular chemical scent of industrial cleaning products that never fully masked what they covered. The kitchen was narrow and functional. Fryers, griddle, walk-in cooler, shelving stacked with canned goods and paper supplies. Behind the walk-in cooler, exactly where Evelyn had described, a door. Locked. Cade reached behind the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. His fingers found the key, taped there with electrical tape, so mundane in its concealment that it proved Evelyn's observation skills and Wade's arrogance in equal measure. The door opened onto narrow stairs descending into a basement that smelled like damp concrete and old cardboard. Cade went first. Duke followed. The others maintained positions throughout the building, Preacher at the back door, Calico at the front window, the rest distributed across the diner's interior in a security posture that was second nature to men who understood perimeter defense at a molecular level. The basement was larger than expected. It ran the full length of the building, low-ceilinged, lit by a single overhead bulb that Cade pulled to life with a chain. Along one wall, metal shelving held boxes of diner supplies, napkins, condiments, the detritus of a food service business. Along the opposite wall, a different kind of storage. 2 filing cabinets, a folding table with a laptop, powered off, and a stack of manila folders held together with a rubber band. A map of Black Hollow pinned to the wall with colored pushpins marking properties, red for acquired, yellow for targeted, blue for something neither Cade nor Duke could immediately decipher. Duke opened the first filing cabinet. Inside, folders organized by address, each containing property records, purchase agreements, and correspondence on Meridian Peak Partners' letterhead. The second cabinet held financial records, bank statements, wire transfers, receipts for payments to local officials that were categorized as consulting fees, and community development contributions, and every other euphemism that corruption hid behind when it dressed itself in paperwork. "This is all of it," Duke said. His voice carried the quiet awe of a man looking at the structural blueprint of a conspiracy that had been operating in plain sight for years. Langley's entire operation, acquisitions, payments, timelines, communication logs, this isn't just fraud. This is systematic corruption of municipal governance for private development gain. "Take everything," Cade said. "Every folder, every document, leave nothing." They worked fast. Emptied both filing cabinets into the saddlebags and storage compartments they had distributed across 6 bikes. Took the laptop. Photographed the map with its pushpins before removing it from the wall. The operation took 11 minutes. Disciplined. Efficient. The kind of targeted evidence acquisition that required military-grade coordination and produced results that civilian investigators would spend months trying to replicate. They were carrying the last box up the basement stairs when the sound reached them. Engines. Not Harleys. Something heavier. Multiple vehicles approaching from the county road at speed, the sound growing from a distant hum to a guttural roar in the span of 30 seconds. Headlights swept across the Silver Spoon's windows, high beams cutting through the snow, and tires screeched on wet asphalt as the vehicles came to a stop in the parking lot. Calico's voice came from the front of the diner, low and tense. 3 trucks. Wade's Dodge plus 2 I don't recognize. 6 men total. They've got... A pause. They've got long guns. Hunting rifles, 2 of them. The rest are carrying pipes and bats. Cade set the box down on the kitchen floor, slowly, carefully. The way you set down something fragile when your hands need to be free for something else. He looked at Duke. Duke looked back. Between them passed the silent communication of men who had been in this position before, outnumbered, outgunned, in a building that offered cover but no exit, facing hostiles with weapons and the righteous fury of men who believed they were defending their territory. "How many of ours are armed?" Cade asked. "Knives? Duke's 45, Bowie's 9, that's it for firearms. The rest of us have whatever we're wearing." Cade closed his eyes, breathed, opened them. The decision tree was narrow and its branches were sharp. Fight and risk gunfire in a building full of his brothers. Surrender the evidence and lose everything. Try to negotiate with a man whose property had been violated, whose victim had been extracted, and whose secret had been discovered, all in the same night. "Nobody draws unless they draw first," Cade said. "We walk out, together. We don't run. We don't hide. We walk out the front door and we face them, and we end this the way it should end, face to face." He walked to the front of the diner. Through the kitchen, past the counter where he had sat 3 mornings watching Evelyn pour coffee, past the booths where his brothers had eaten eggs and built surveillance profiles without ever appearing to look up from their plates. He reached the front door and pushed it open. Snow and headlights. The parking lot was a theater. Wade's Dodge at center stage with its high beams flooding the diner entrance, 2 pickup trucks flanking it, and 6 men arranged in a loose line between the vehicles and the building. Wade stood front and center, a hunting rifle held across his body in a carry position that was not quite aimed and not quite lowered. The ambiguous posture of a man who wanted the threat without the commitment. Beside him, Briggs, in uniform, hand on his holster, looking like he was going to be sick. Behind them, 4 men Cade didn't recognize. Locals, probably, recruited from bars and hunting camps, the kind of men who answered calls from Wade Turner because Wade Turner had spent decades building exactly this kind of loyalty through favors and pressure and the tribal mechanics of small-town allegiance. Cade walked out. The revenants followed. 11 men in leather, scarred, snow-covered, each one carrying the specific weight of a personal history that included violence they didn't choose and damage they couldn't shed. They spread across the diner's entrance, not advancing, not retreating, occupying the space with the silent authority of men who had held ground in places where holding ground was measured in blood. "You broke into my building," Wade said. The rifle shifted against his chest. "That's breaking and entering. That's a felony. Harlan's a witness." "What's in your basement, Wade?" Cade's voice was steady, conversational, the calm of a man who held cards the other player didn't know about. The filing cabinets, the property records, the Meridian Peak letterhead. What would Victor Langley say if he knew you kept paper copies of everything? The name hit Wade like a physical blow. His head snapped back a fraction of an inch. The involuntary recoil of a man hearing something he believed was secret spoken aloud by someone who should not have known it. His grip on the rifle tightened. The tendons in his hands went white. "You don't know what you're talking about." $42 million resort development. Shell companies buying property through your name. Consulting fees to the sheriff's office. I'm guessing Langley doesn't know you kept records. I'm guessing Langley specifically told you not to keep records. And I'm guessing that makes you a liability, Wade. To the one man you can't afford to be a liability to. The other men in Wade's line exchanged glances. They had come for a confrontation about a woman and a break-in. What they were hearing was something else entirely. A layer of their town's reality they hadn't known existed, spoken by a stranger in a leather jacket who had no reason to lie because lies didn't carry that kind of specificity. "Shut your mouth," Wade said. The rifle came up 2 inches. Not aimed, not yet. But closer. "Those files are already in transit," Cade said. The lie was tactical, sized it. The files were still in saddlebags 20 feet behind him, but the effect was immediate. Wade's face went from angry to something adjacent to panic, the expression of a man calculating exposure, calculating consequences, calculating what Victor Langley did to people who became liabilities in his operation. "You're bluffing. Call Langley and find out." Wade's phone was in his hand before he realized what he was doing. The reflexive reach of a man whose power structure had just been threatened at its highest node. He stopped, looked at the phone, looked at Cade. And in that frozen moment, standing in the snow with a rifle in one hand and a phone in the other, Wade Turner looked exactly like what he was. Not a monster, not a mastermind, but a middleman. A small man serving a larger man's interests. Given just enough power to be useful and just enough rope to hang himself. "Here's what's going to happen," Cade said. He took one step forward, just one. But the step crossed a line that everyone in the parking lot could feel. The invisible boundary between standoff and confrontation, between words and whatever comes afterwards, fail. "You're going to lower that rifle. Your friends are going to get back in their trucks. Deputy Briggs is going to go home and start thinking very carefully about which side of this he wants to be on when the state attorney general starts asking questions. And you, Wade, you're going to stand in this parking lot and watch us ride out of your town, and you're going to do nothing. Because the only thing keeping Victor Langley from finding out that his local asset kept paper records of a $42 million fraud operation is my silence. And my silence has conditions." The parking lot held its breath. Snow fell on rifle barrels and leather jackets, and the hoods of trucks, and the exposed skin of men whose faces were registering various stages of comprehension. From Briggs, who looked like a man watching his career and freedom dissolve in real time, to the 4 locals who were beginning to understand that the simple favor they had agreed to was connected to something that could swallow all of them. Wade's rifle trembled. His arms were shaking, not from cold, not from weight, but from the systemic failure of a man whose control had been built on the assumption that nobody would ever push back, and who was now facing a push so fundamental that the entire architecture of his power was cracking along fault lines he didn't know existed. One of the locals, a thick man in a canvas jacket and a John Deere hat, lowered his baseball bat, took a step back, then another. "I didn't sign up for this, Wade," he said. "Whatever this is, I didn't sign up." He walked to his truck, got in, and drove away. The defection was seismic. 2 more locals followed within 30 seconds, dropping their weapons in the snow and retreating to vehicles with the hurried, head-down gait of men trying to outrun their own complicity. That left Wade, Briggs, and one remaining local, a younger man with a pipe wrench who looked terrified and frozen, unable to decide whether the greater danger was staying or leaving. "Harlan," Wade said. His voice had changed. The authority was gone. What remained was desperation. Raw, animal, the sound of a man watching his world narrow to a point. "Do something." Briggs looked at his cousin, looked at the revenants, looked at the snow falling on a town he had spent his entire career pretending to protect, while actually serving the interests of one man. His hand came off his holster, his shoulders dropped, the posture of surrender. Not physical, but existential. "I can't, Wade," Briggs said. "This is beyond. I can't." He walked to his patrol car, got in. The engine started. The headlights came on. And Deputy Harlan Briggs drove out of the Silver Spoon's parking lot for the last time, leaving his cousin standing alone in the snow with a rifle he didn't have the nerve to raise and a kingdom that was collapsing around him in real time. Wade looked at Cade, the rifle lowered to his side. The fight was leaving his body the way air leaves a punctured tire. Not suddenly, but steadily, a sustained deflation that left the shape intact but removed everything that made it functional. "She'll talk," Wade said. His voice was hollow now, emptied. "Evelyn? She'll tell them everything." "Yes. And the files? Already gone. Langley will—" Wade stopped, swallowed something that tasted like the future he had just lost. "Langley will bury me." "Probably. You don't care." "Not even a little." Wade Turner stood alone in the parking lot of his diner, snow accumulating on his shoulders and his rifle and the hood of his truck, and the last of his composure crumbled. He didn't scream, didn't charge, didn't raise the weapon. He just stood there, a man stripped of every mechanism of control he had built over decades, exposed to the cold in every possible meaning of the word, and the look on his face was not remorse. It was the pure, uncut terror of a man who had just realized that the machine he served was going to turn on him, and there was no one left to protect him from it, because Victor Langley did not tolerate liability. And Wade Turner, standing in a snowy parking lot with State Attorney General-bound evidence bearing his name on every page, had just become the biggest liability in a $42 million operation. Cade turned his back on Wade Turner, walked to his bike, mounted it. The engine fired, and the sound was enormous in the silent town. A declaration, a punctuation mark, a signal to every revenant that the operation was complete and the road was calling. They rode. 11 Harleys through Black Hollow's main street past the shuttered stores and the broken streetlights and the dark windows behind which the town slept or pretended to sleep. The evidence rode with them in saddlebags and storage compartments, the paperweight of a conspiracy that had been eating this town alive for years, and each mile they put between themselves and the Silver Spoon was a mile closer to the moment when that weight would land on desks and in courtrooms and in the consciousness of people with the power to act. Cade's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket at 3:12 in the morning. He pulled to the shoulder, read the message. 3 words from Roach. "She's safe. Asheville." He closed his eyes. Snow fell on his face, on his helmet, on the machine between his legs that had carried him thousands of miles through a life built on damage and driven by the need to ensure that the damage stopped somewhere. Behind his eyelids, Lily's face. Not the photograph version, the real version, the 22-year-old standing in a doorway with a dimming smile, asking without words for someone to see what was happening to her. He opened his eyes, looked at the road ahead, looked at his brothers idling behind him in formation, engines rumbling, exhaust clouds rising into the frozen dark, 11 men waiting for a direction from a man who finally knew where he was going. "Asheville," Cade said. "All of us. Now." But before the first bike moved, headlights appeared on the road behind them. Not trucks, not patrol cars. Something else. A black sedan, moving fast, too fast for the road conditions. Its high beams cutting through the snow with the cold precision of something that wasn't from Black Hollow. Something that had been dispatched from somewhere else. Somewhere with money. Somewhere with resources. Somewhere that had just received a phone call from a panicking middleman in a dying mining town and had decided that the situation required a different kind of response. The sedan slowed, stopped, 200 yards behind the last Harley in formation. Its headlights held steady, engine idling, a black shape in the white snow, waiting, watching. And every revenant on that road understood, with the simultaneous bone-deep recognition of men who had been hunted before, that the war they thought they had just won was only the opening battle, and the real enemy had just arrived. The black sedan sat 200 yards behind them, like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. Its headlights burned through the falling snow with the sterile precision of surgical lights, and the engine idled with a low mechanical patience that said whoever was inside had nowhere else to be, and all the time in the world to wait. Cade straddled his Road King at the front of the formation, hands on the grips, the vibration of his engine traveling through his wrists and into the architecture of his skeleton where it mixed with the vibration already there. The one that had lived in his bones since Roanoke, since Lily, since the first time he learned that monsters didn't always look like monsters, and that the most dangerous ones wore suits and signed checks. "Nobody moves," Cade said into the cold. The words carried down the formation, passed from rider to rider in the shorthand of men who communicated through engine revs and helmet tilts, and the particular cadence of a leader's voice when the situation required stillness over speed. The sedan's driver door opened. A man stepped out. Tall. Overcoat. No weapon visible. He stood beside the vehicle with his hands in his pockets, and the posture was so deliberate, so curated, that it communicated more than aggression ever could. This was a man who didn't need weapons because weapons were crude and his power operated on a different frequency entirely. He walked forward, slowly, through the snow, past the idling sedan, toward the line of Harleys that stretched across the shoulder of a frozen Appalachian road at 3:20 in the morning. Each step was measured. Each step said, "I own the ground I'm walking on, even if the deed is in someone else's name." He stopped 30 feet from Cade's front wheel. The headlights behind him turned his silhouette into a black cutout against white light, faceless, featureless, a shape defined entirely by the absence of detail. Then he spoke, and his voice was the voice of boardrooms and fundraising dinners and closed-door negotiations where the currency was influence and the exchange rate was human suffering. "Mr. Mercer, my name is—" "I know who you are." Victor Langley paused. The interruption was a data point, and Cade could almost see him processing it, recalibrating his approach the way a machine recalibrates when the input deviates from the expected parameters. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of face that appeared in magazines next to words like visionary and philanthropist. A face designed by decades of careful curation to project trustworthiness while concealing the gears turning behind it. "Then you know this doesn't have to be complicated," Langley said. His breath made small, precise clouds in the cold air. "You have documents that belong to a private business entity. Those documents were obtained through unauthorized entry into private property. The legal position is straightforward. Return them, and I see no reason for this to escalate." "Your legal position," Cade said, "is a $42 million fraud operation built on shell companies, bribed officials, and a man who beat a woman for 3 years while you signed his checks." Langley's expression didn't change. The accusation landed on the surface of his composure and slid off like rain on treated glass. Men like Langley had been absorbing accusations their entire careers, filtering them, categorizing them, determining which ones required response, and which ones could be starved of oxygen until they died. "Wade Turner's personal conduct is not my concern or my responsibility," Langley said. "Business relationships are business relationships. What a man does in his private life is exactly your concern when you put him there." Cade's voice hadn't risen, hadn't changed in pitch or tempo, but it had acquired a density that made the air between them feel heavier, as if the words themselves had mass. "You put Wade Turner in Black Hollow. You funded him. You gave him authority over a town and everyone in it. And when he used that authority to break a woman's ribs and lock her in rooms and crush every exit she had until the only door left was the one that led back to him. That's your architecture, your design. The same design you used when you bankrolled Marcus Cole's defense in Roanoke 17 years ago, and a woman named Lily Mercer died because your money made sure her abuser walked free. The name landed differently. Not on glass this time, but on something less prepared, something deeper in Langley's architecture that the public facade wasn't built to protect. His posture shifted, a microscopic adjustment, the kind that civilian eyes would miss, but that combat-trained eyes caught the way a sensor catches heat. He knew the name. He remembered the case, and the fact that he remembered meant it wasn't just a line item in a portfolio of favors and transactions. It was something that had stayed, something with weight, something he had filed away but never fully discarded. "That's a very old story," Langley said carefully. "She's still dead. Doesn't get older than that." Silence. The snow fell between them like static on a screen, filling the space with white noise that was both everything and nothing. Behind Langley, the sedan idled with its lights burning. Behind Cade, 11 revenants sat on 11 machines, each man processing the confrontation through the filter of his own damage, his own wars, his own understanding of what it meant to face a man whose power was so diffused through systems and institutions that destroying him required destroying the systems themselves. Duke dismounted. The sound of his boots hitting the road was deliberate, not threatening, but present. He walked forward and stood beside Cade, and his prosthetic hand caught the headlight glow and threw it back in fragments. "I served 2 tours in Fallujah," Duke said. His voice was gravel and wire. "Came back with half a hand and a head full of things I can't talk about at dinner parties. And the worst thing I ever saw. Worse than the IEDs, worse than the ambushes, worse than carrying pieces of my friends in bags, was coming home and finding out that the country I fought for runs on men like you. Men who build empires on top of people who can't fight back and call it enterprise." Langley's jaw tightened. The composure was still intact, but the foundation beneath it was showing stress fractures. Tiny, visible only to people trained to see them, the same way hairline cracks in a bridge are visible only to engineers who know what to look for. "I came here to resolve this quietly," Langley said. "I'm still willing to do that. The documents are returned. You leave the state. No charges are filed for the break-in. No one needs to—" "The documents are already in the hands of a forensic accountant," Cade said. "Beckett Greer, former state attorney general's office. They'll be on the AG's desk by Thursday, along with a full report on Meridian Peak Partners, your shell company acquisitions, your payments to local officials, and your operational relationship with Wade Turner, including the systematic abuse of a woman who lived inside your operation for 3 years. The composure cracked. Not dramatically. Langley was too practiced for that. But the crack was real. A visible fissure in the surface that revealed the temperature of what lay beneath. His hands came out of his pockets. His fingers flexed. The body language of a man whose contingency plans were failing in sequence, each fallback position overrun before he could occupy it. "You don't understand what you're doing," Langley said. His voice had dropped the boardroom register and found something rawer underneath. Not anger, not fear, but the cold pragmatism of a man who had survived decades of business by understanding consequences better than anyone in any room he entered. "This project employs 200 people during construction. It brings infrastructure, tax revenue, jobs to a town that hasn't had jobs in 30 years. You destroy Meridian Peak, you destroy Black Hollow's only chance at— Black Hollow's only chance at what?" Cade stepped off his bike, one boot on the road, then the other, standing, full height, the scar on his temple catching the light. "Being consumed? Being erased? Having its bones picked clean by a man who bought it piece by piece through a middleman who beat women for stress relief? That's not a chance, Langley. That's a menu. And the town was never invited to sit at the table." Langley looked at Cade, looked at the revenants behind him, looked at the road and the snow and the dark mountains rising on either side like the walls of a corridor with no exit. The calculation in his eyes was shifting, moving from offense to defense, from retrieval to containment, from winning to limiting loss. A man like Victor Langley didn't collapse. He retreated. He restructured. He found the angle that preserved the maximum amount of his architecture while sacrificing the minimum. "Wade Turner acted independently," Langley said. The words came out like something rehearsed, a legal position being field-tested before it reached an attorney's desk. Any actions he took regarding Evelyn Cross were personal and unauthorized. Meridian Peak Partners has no involvement in or knowledge of. Save it for the deposition. Langley's mouth closed. The sentence died. And in the silence that followed, standing on a frozen road in the middle of nowhere at 3:30 in the morning, Victor Langley looked at Cade Mercer with an expression that was neither surrender nor defiance, but something more precise. The recognition of a man encountering a force he couldn't buy, couldn't litigate, couldn't route around, couldn't absorb into his system. A force that existed outside the parameters of his power entirely, operating on a frequency he didn't have equipment to receive. "This isn't over," Langley said. But the words had no weight. They were reflexive. The automated response of a man who had been saying, "This isn't over," his entire life, because it had always been true, because his resources had always been sufficient to ensure continuation. Except now the resources were the problem. The paper trail was the problem. The meticulous documentation that Wade Turner had kept in a basement, the insurance policy of a frightened middleman who knew his employer well enough to keep receipts, was the problem. And problems made of paper couldn't be solved with money or influence or the carefully maintained relationships that Victor Langley had spent a lifetime cultivating. He walked back to the sedan, got in. The door closed with the heavy, hermetic sound of expensive engineering. The headlights held for a moment, one long, final second of illumination, and then the sedan reversed, turned, and drove away into the snow in the dark, its taillights shrinking until they were 2 red points, and then nothing at all. Cade stood in the road and watched it disappear. The snow fell on his shoulders and his hair and the leather that had been his second skin for longer than he could remember. Behind him, no one spoke. The engines idled. The mountains held their silence. And the night, which had been the longest of Cade Mercer's life since the night Lily died, began its slow, imperceptible turn toward dawn. They rode to Asheville in formation. 4 hours through mountain roads that wound like damaged veins through the Appalachian dark, the asphalt slick with snow that gradually turned to rain as they descended in elevation, the temperature climbing degree by reluctant degree from freezing to merely cold. Nobody stopped. Nobody fell behind. The formation held the way it always held. Through discipline, through habit, through the unspoken contract between men who had agreed to ride together and therefore had agreed to arrive together. An arrival meant wherever the road ended and the reason for riding began. Dawn broke gray and wet over Asheville. The city materialized around them gradually. Gas stations, then strip malls, then the older streets closer to downtown where brick buildings and coffee shops replaced the vacancy of the highway corridor. Beckett Greer's office was above a print shop on Lexington Avenue, accessible through a side door and a narrow staircase that smelled like toner and old carpet. They parked the Harleys in a line on the street, and the sound of 11 engines dying in sequence at 6:40 in the morning drew faces to windows and pedestrians to curbs. But the revenants paid no attention because attention from strangers was the background noise of their existence and had been for years. Roach met them at the door. His face was drawn, unshaven. The face of a man who had driven through the night on adrenaline and purpose and was now running on the fumes of both. Behind him, in Greer's office, Evelyn Cross sat in a chair with a blanket around her shoulders and a mug of tea in her hands that she held with both palms, absorbing the warmth the way a person absorbs evidence that the world contains things other than pain. She looked up when Cade walked in. Their eyes met, and what passed between them was not romance, not attraction, not the manufactured chemistry of a cinematic moment. It was recognition. The deep, bone-level acknowledgement between two people who had been inside the same kind of darkness and had emerged on the same morning into the same gray light, carrying the same wounds in different bodies. "You're here," she said. "Told you we would be." She almost smiled. Not quite. But the muscles around her eyes shifted in a way that suggested the machinery of smiling still existed somewhere inside her, buried under 3 years of disuse, waiting for enough safety to justify the energy it required. Greer was at his desk, surrounded by the contents of Wade Turner's filing cabinets, papers spread across every horizontal surface, including the floor. He was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses, and the intense, focused energy of someone who had found the thing they were born to do and was doing it at 3 times normal speed. He looked up when Cade entered, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to joy that a forensic accountant could produce without violating professional ethics. "It's all here," Greer said. "Every acquisition, every payment, every communication between Turner and Meridian Peak's management structure. The consulting fees to Sheriff Gatlin alone are enough for a corruption indictment, and that's before we get to the property manipulation, the code enforcement irregularities, and the coordination with county planning officials to suppress public notice requirements for the development application." He tapped a folder on his desk. "I've already drafted the referral letter to the Attorney General's office. A colleague there, someone I trust, is expecting my call at 9. "How long until something happens?" Duke asked. "Days, not weeks. The evidence is that clean. Turner kept records like a man who was afraid of his employer, and afraid men keep very detailed records because detail is the only leverage they have. Langley's attorneys will fight it, but the paper trail is comprehensive enough that the AG's office won't be able to ignore it without exposing themselves to scrutiny." Cade nodded, looked at Evelyn. "There's a medical component." "Hound documented everything," Roach said from the doorway. "Photographs, written assessment, injury timeline based on Evelyn's testimony. I've already sent copies to Greer and to a domestic violence advocacy organization in Asheville that Moth contacted last night." Evelyn set down her tea. Her hands had stopped shaking. Not completely. The tremor was still there, a faint vibration in her fingers like the aftershock of an earthquake that had already passed. But the violence of the shaking was gone, replaced by something more manageable, more survivable, the trembling of a body transitioning from crisis to aftermath. "My cousin," Evelyn said, "in Asheville. Her name is Sarah Watts. I don't have her number. Haven't talked to her in 4 years. Moth was already on his phone. 6 minutes later, he had a number. Evelyn stared at it on the screen for a long time before she dialed. The phone rang 3 times. A voice answered, and Evelyn Cross said her own name out loud to someone who knew her from before Black Hollow, before Wade, before the bruises and the locked doors and the 3 years of systematic erasure that had reduced her to a function in someone else's machine. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, Evelyn was crying, but the crying was different from any crying she had done in years. It wasn't the compressed, silent crying of a woman who couldn't afford to be heard. It was open, audible, messy. The crying of someone who had found a crack in the wall wide enough to fit through and was feeling the air on the other side for the first time. "She wants me to come," Evelyn said. "She has a room. She said—" Her voice broke, rebuilt. "She said she'd been worried. She said she tried to call and the number was disconnected and she didn't know where I went. Because Wade disconnected it. Because isolation required the severing of every line that connected the captive to the world outside the cage. Because that was how the architecture worked. Not through chains, but through the removal of alternatives until the cage became the world, and the world became invisible." Hound drove Evelyn to her cousin's house in the Explorer they had bought from Carl Jessup. Cade didn't go. This was deliberate. The moment of reunion, the doorway, the embrace, the specific geography of a woman stepping into a home where she was wanted, belonged to Evelyn and Sarah, and the presence of a scarred ex-Marine biker with 17 years of guilt in his chest would alter the chemistry of it in ways that helped nobody. He sat in Greer's office instead, in the chair Evelyn had vacated, holding a mug of coffee that Moth had sourced from the shop next door. The coffee was good, better than the silver spoons. He drank it slowly, feeling the warmth move through his chest, and the warmth was such a simple thing, such a small, unremarkable physical sensation, that its effect on him was disproportionate, overwhelming, the way a single match feels enormous when you've been in the dark long enough to forget that light exists. Duke sat beside him. The 2 men didn't speak for a long time. They had known each other for 11 years, since a VA parking lot in Knoxville, where Duke was sitting on a curb with his new prosthetic still in its packaging, unable to bring himself to put it on, and Cade had sat down beside him and said nothing for 45 minutes until Duke finally opened the box. That was the club's origin story, or one version of it. The moment when 2 broken men discovered that proximity to another broken man didn't fix anything but made the brokenness bearable, The way leaning against a wall doesn't repair the wall, but keeps you from falling. "You okay?" Duke asked. "No?" "Good. Me neither." They sat with that. The honesty of it. The relief of admitting damage without being asked to fix it or explain it or transform it into something uplifting. They were not okay. They might never be okay. But they were sitting in chairs drinking coffee in a city where a woman with cracked ribs was being held by a cousin who had been looking for her. And the files that would dismantle a $42 million fraud operation were spread across a desk being organized by a man who knew exactly what to do with them. And outside, 11 Harley-Davidsons sat in a line on a street in Asheville, catching the first gray light of a morning that had been earned through the expenditure of everything they had. The days that followed moved at the speed of consequence. Greer's referral reached the state attorney general's office on Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, state investigators had opened a preliminary inquiry into Meridian Peak Partners. By the following Monday, Sheriff Roy Gatlin received a phone call from the State Police Internal Affairs Division requesting his voluntary cooperation in an investigation into payments received from entities connected to Victor Langley. Gatlin cooperated. Men like Gatlin always cooperated when the alternative was presented in legal terminology by people with state-level authority. The same survival instinct that had made him loyal to Wade now made him loyal to whoever held the bigger stick. Deputy Harlan Briggs resigned before he was asked to. He drove to the state police barracks voluntarily, sat in an interview room for 6 hours, and provided testimony that corroborated the paper trail in Wade Turner's files. The testimony was detailed, comprehensive, and delivered with the desperate fluency of a man trying to build a lifeboat out of cooperation before the ship went down. Wade Turner was arrested on a Tuesday morning at the Silver Spoon by 2 state police officers who drove up from the county seat and walked into the diner with warrants and the specific, unhurried professionalism of people who had done this before and would do it again. He was charged with the domestic violence, assault, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Additional charges were pending. He didn't resist. The man who had controlled a woman and a town through fear and institutional leverage went quietly when confronted by an authority he couldn't corrupt, and the quietness was the most telling detail of all. Proof that his power had never been personal but systemic, and without the system, he was just a man in an empty diner with nothing left to own. Victor Langley was not arrested. Men like Langley operated at altitudes where the air was thin and the law moved slowly, and the investigation into Meridian Peak Partners would take months to produce indictments. But the development application for the Hollow Ridge Resort and Conference Center was suspended by the County Planning Commission within a week of the state investigation becoming public. Langley's attorneys issued statements. Langley himself issued nothing. He retreated into the architecture of his wealth and his connections and waited, the way men like him always waited, for the storm to pass, for the attention to shift, for the public memory to do what it always did and forget. But the files were thorough, and Beckett Greer was relentless, and the state attorney general's office, once engaged, had neither the inclination nor the political luxury to disengage. The investigation would continue. The connections would be traced. The $42 million machine would be dismantled piece by piece, and every piece would bear the fingerprints of the man who built it. Cade didn't stay in Asheville. The revenants weren't built for cities, for waiting rooms, for the slow administrative grind of legal process. They were built for roads, for movement, for the particular kind of purpose that lived in the space between departure and arrival, in the engine's hum and the highway's pull and the knowledge that somewhere ahead there was someone who needed what they had. Not strength, not violence, but the willingness to stop. Before they left, Cade rode to Sarah Watt's house. A small bungalow on a quiet street with a garden that had been put to bed for winter and a porch light that was on even in daylight. A signal, maybe, or a habit, or just the kind of detail that separated homes from buildings. He didn't go inside. He sat on his bike at the curb with the engine off, and after a few minutes, Evelyn came out. She walked differently. He noticed it immediately. Not the guarded shuffle of the Silver Spoon, the compressed gait of a woman navigating around a threat that occupied every room. This was slower, more upright, the walk of someone relearning the dimensions of a body that was allowed to take up space. Her ribs were wrapped, her face was still bruised, and she held her left arm carefully, but her eyes were different. The drowning look was gone. In its place was something he didn't have a word for, something that existed between exhaustion and relief, between damage and the slow, uncertain beginning of repair. She sat on the porch steps. He stayed on the bike. The distance between them was deliberate, close enough to talk, far enough to breathe. "You're leaving," she said. "Yeah." "Where?" "South." "Then wherever." She nodded. The nod of a woman who understood that wherever was not vagueness but vocabulary, the specific language of men who had been through enough to know that destinations were less important than directions, and directions were less important than the decision to keep moving. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Don't. It's not—" Cade stopped, looked at his hands on the handlebars, the scarred knuckles, the calluses from a lifetime of gripping things, rifles, wrenches, motorcycle grips, the edge of a hospital bed in Roanoke where his sister lay dying while he held her hand and promised things he couldn't deliver. "It's not about thanks. It's about what you do now. You're out. You're alive. What you build from here, that's yours. All of it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The winter sun, low and pale, found a gap in the clouds and briefly lit the street with the kind of light that made everything look temporary and precious. The houses, the bare trees, the man on the motorcycle, the woman on the steps. "Will you come back through?" she asked. "If the road goes this way." "The road goes every way." Cade looked at her, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, something shifted in his chest. Not a resolution, not a healing, but a loosening, the first fractional release of a compression that had been tightening for 17 years. Lily was still dead. The guilt was still there. The scar tissue was still the architecture of his interior. But something in the geometry had changed. Something had moved from its fixed position, allowing the structure to settle differently, to bear the weight from a new angle that didn't eliminate the load, but distributed it in a way that made breathing slightly less like labor. "I'll come through," he said. She smiled, a real one. Small and damaged and imperfect and real, the way everything real is imperfect, and everything imperfect is the only thing worth trusting. It lasted 2 seconds. Then she stood, pressed her hand briefly against the porch railing as if grounding herself in the solidity of a structure that was hers to leave or stay in, and walked inside. Cade started the engine. The sound filled the quiet street and then receded as he rode away, and Evelyn stood at the window and watched until the bike turned the corner and disappeared and the sound faded into the general hum of a city going about its morning. The Iron Revenants left Asheville at noon. 14 bikes, Roach, Moth, and Hound, had rejoined the formation, riding south on highways that cut through the Blue Ridge like sutures through skin. The mountains rose and fell around them, and the sky opened gradually from gray to something lighter. Not blue exactly, not yet, but the promise of blue. The atmospheric suggestion that somewhere above the cloud cover, the sun was doing what it always did, and the world was turning toward warmth even if the warmth hadn't arrived yet. They rode for hours without speaking. The wind did the talking, the engines did the singing, the road did the thinking. And somewhere in the formation, in the space between the first bike and the last, the Iron Revenants carried something they hadn't carried when they rode into Black Hollow 5 days ago. Not victory, which was too clean a word for what had happened, and not redemption, which was too grand. Something smaller, something more human. The knowledge that they had stopped, that they had seen what was happening and they had not ridden past it. That in a diner in a dying town, a woman poured coffee with shaking hands, and they stayed. Cade rode at the front. The photograph of Lily was in his jacket pocket, where it always was. But for the first time in 17 years, he didn't reach for it, not because he had forgotten, not because the grief had ended, but because the photograph had been a reminder of failure, and what he carried now was not failure but its opposite, the imperfect, costly, scarred evidence that he had finally done the thing he couldn't do before. Not perfectly, not without damage, but done. The highway stretched ahead, gray and endless, curving through mountains that had been there before anything human and would be there after. The Revenants rode in formation, and the formation held the way it always held, not because the men were unbreakable, but because they had agreed to break together, and breaking together was the closest thing to unbreakable that damaged men could build. Miles behind them, in a bungalow in Asheville, Evelyn Cross sat at her cousin's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that she had poured herself, in a room that nobody locked, in a life that was beginning again, the way all lives begin again after catastrophe. Slowly, uncertainly, with the terrifying, exhilarating, and deeply human recognition that the next step was hers to take, and the direction was hers to choose. And miles ahead, the road unspooled into the American South, and the revenants followed it the way they always did. Together, damaged, unbowed, carrying their ghosts and their guilt and their stubborn, scarred refusal to stop protecting the people the world had decided weren't worth protecting. The engines faded. The highway swallowed them. And Black Hollow, 5 days behind them, sat in its valley between exhausted ridges, finally, slowly, beginning to remember what it felt like when someone gave a damn.